From the House of Representatives, March 11, 2021. Mr. President, the following bills passed the House in an amended form by the votes indicated. Message number 193, House Bill number 67, Geothermal Energy Review, ayes 55, noes 5. Message number 164, March 11, 2021. House Bill number 122, Hunting and Fishing Access Reliable Funding, ayes 34, noes 26. March 11, 2021, message number 195, House Bill number 150, State Budgeting and Expenditure Authority, ayes 54, noes 6, signed Wendy Harding, House Chief Clerk.
Reports from standing committees.
March 11, 2021, Mr. President, your committee number 12, Rules and Procedures, to whom is referred Senate File 147, Management Council Authority and Legislative Committees, respectfully report same back to the Senate with a recommendation that it do pass. Ayes, Senator Dockstader, Driscoll, Guru, Hicks, and Rothfuss. Senator Dockstader, Chairman.
Mr. Majority Floor Leader, give us some direction here.
All of ourselves into committee of the whole.
For the motion, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. Senator Boner, Senate's back in your good hands. Okay, members of the Senate, we'll continue discussion on standing committee amendment number 1 to Senate File 143. Any further discussion? Senator Wasserman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to let the Education Committee know that I'm going to bring an amendment on second reading on class sizes. And I think the primary grades, it's very important that we have small class sizes. We're raising it from 16 to 20. And I'd like to keep that at 18. So you will see that amendment on second reading.
Senator Scott.
Mr. Chairman, let me make a suggestion that we've really got two ways to approach the whole problem of teacher compensation and class size. There's a trade-off there. What your standing committee is proposing is a larger increase in class size in the block grant model, get rid of all the ghost teachers, and that enables us to do an increase, bringing the teacher salaries up and up to where close to where it actually is. If we reduce that class size, I would urge that to keep a balance, we also ought to reduce the size of the increase for the teachers. I think the two are linked together. So I would urge consideration of that, and do that, then it's two philosophically different approaches that get us close to the same net position. And we can debate that very well, Mr. Chairman. But I would suggest that as a component if an amendment comes in to raise to lower the class sizes back down closer to where they are.
Any further discussion on standing committee amendment number 1? Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On and against standing committee amendment number 1, and I was against it in committee. I wanted to share with the chamber my concerns. And Mr. Chairman, there's a lot obviously that goes into this particular standing committee amendment. It was aggregated of 13 or so amendments, I think, that we looked at in the committee. And I won't go line by line, but there are some general themes that I think are broadly applicable. And that, Mr. Chairman, is what I'll discuss. I've done 3 recalibrations and had the pleasure of serving on the Education Committee for the past decade now. And a lot of themes have been reinforced through the Education Committee over the years and through the obligations of the state of Wyoming under our Constitution and the interpretations of the Constitution by the Supreme Court through the Campbell decisions. And we don't always like what the Supreme Court says. So we like to look back and read the Constitution ourselves and reinterpret it ourselves because, well, we don't like what the Supreme Court says. And we're all guilty of that. So we agree with the court when it agrees with us, we disagree with the court when it doesn't, and everything's unconstitutional if we don't like it. That was actually something that the late Justice Scalia said that, you know, what's unconstitutional? Things I don't like. It's a great quote. It was right in Laramie, Wyoming. I think a good senator from Judiciary Committee was at that same discussion. The challenge is they're literally the branch of government that gets to make the decision. And while they change their mind, they all seem to adhere to this concept of stare decisis, where they go back and read their old Supreme Court decisions before they make the next one. It's not a fresh look each time. They refer to their precedent when they're making the future decisions. So, Mr. Chairman, the idea that they're going to scrap the Campbell decisions and not read through them if we have another court challenge strikes me as a bit of a stretch. So when it says in the Campbell decision that the decisions that we base our funding model on have to be evidence-based, I would expect that they'll read that. When they say that it has to be cost-based, I'd expect they would read that. Equitable, they'll probably know they said that before. And that a shortage of revenue shall not be an excuse, explicitly stated, because this is the highest priority for funding for the state of Wyoming based on its constitutional origin. Again, Mr. Chairman, I don't think they're going to overlook that when they get to that section of their decisions. So when we contemplate this budget amendment in the context and light of the Campbell decisions, and what has been written about the obligations for our funding model, we have to think, are the changes we're making to the consultant and peer-reviewed evidence-based recommendations provided to us, are those changes evidence-based? Are they equitable? Are they cost-based? And do they provide a high-quality uniform education for all students in the state of Wyoming? It's hard to look at these amendments and answer yes to each of those questions. Because, and really, you know, no fault to the originators of these amendments, and it wasn't just the good chairman. A lot of these amendments have come from other legislators and been aggregated and been discussed for quite a while. But the key, Mr. Chairman, and the concern I have is that none of them are evidence-based. We want the number to go down. That's the motivation. It's not about making education better. Small classroom sizes are better. That's what the evidence says. No question about it. That's what the evidence says. There is no evidence anywhere that says we need really large classrooms, schools will be better. It just doesn't say that in the evidence. And we know that. But we want the number to go down. And we also know from the market and from other consultants that we hire to come in and give us market analyses on an annual basis, telling us the challenges of the workforce and doing cost comparisons between the labor market associated with education and comparable wages in other labor markets, both in neighboring states and in similar labor market comparators. We know that the wages that we're paying right now are probably about where they're supposed to be, which the good tall senator said a minute ago. We were actually above market a few years ago. Above market 5-ish years ago led to us getting the very best applicants. When you'd put a job out for a elementary school educator in the state of Wyoming, you'd get 100 applicants, not just from Wyoming, but from the neighboring region. That tells you something. And our consultants use that type of analysis to say, all right, you're clearly going to get the best of the best because you're paying above market. At this point in time, we know from our studies that we're still getting applicants, but we're getting far less. So there's some competition, but it tends to be a little closer, not reaching as far out into our neighboring states. And so we know we're probably somewhere around where we need to be in that cost of teacher salaries. We focus a lot and shake our fist a lot at the anecdotes that we hear about, and most, Mr. Chairman, of what we base our educational feelings on, that gut instinct that drives us and motivates us, is based on the anecdotes, not necessarily the data or the model. But when you look at the model itself, when you just look at the cold hard numbers, it's almost entirely driven by how many teachers do we pay and how much do we pay them. The other stuff is much, much smaller in magnitude. It's still consequential, and we can argue about it. We could fix it. We could improve it. We could increase the efficiency. But at the end of the day, how many teachers have you got? And what's the salary you're paying them? That's what it comes down to. So when we contemplate, for example, the most critical cut that's in this amendment, and one of the reasons why I strongly oppose it, the idea that we're going to increase the classroom sizes in the model against the evidence, and the discussion was we're knocking out 900 positions, but it's okay because those 900 positions haven't been filled. Well, that sounds good when you think about it, right? We're not getting rid of anybody. But the regrettable reality is the model underfunds right now dramatically by around 10% teacher salaries. So we fund them higher, and we compensate for that in reality by having fewer teachers. The districts can't afford in the labor market to hire as many teachers as we have in the model because the model doesn't provide enough resources per teacher. We're not talking about the superintendent cuts or the principals or anything else. We're talking about just the teachers and the number we've got, because that's the driver. If we don't pay enough in the model for the salaries, and we've been doing this chronically, and I'll remind the chamber, we haven't changed that in any of the last 3 recalibrations because we've rejected the recalibration recommendations in favor of the legislative model, which still had too low of a funding for salaries. That's why that remains there. It's not because we haven't heard the right answer. It's because we've rejected the right answer because the right answer cost us more each time. Between 50 and 100 million, depending on which instance of the recalibration, how much more did it cost us? And we wanted to go with the cheaper solution. We went with the legislative model. So the idea that because we see this number of ghost teachers, and we can eliminate that, as if the model is an a la carte menu, and we take the things where we see it as being overfunded and eliminate that, but ignore and pretend those areas that are underfunded don't exist, just doesn't work that way. That's why it's a comprehensive model instead of a series of individual points, Mr. Chairman. So we can't do that. So what's the net effect then if we eliminate the $150 million or so that this amendment effectively eliminates? We don't know the exact number, but 130 to 150 is probably the ballpark of where we're at based on this amendment. 10-ish%, 8 to 10%. Well, you look at how many teachers does $150 million a year represent? That's really what it comes down to, because that's what you're cutting. They don't have a lot of other things they fund in school districts. They fund teachers for the most part. And again, we can do a better job of making more of the funding go to teachers. There's actually a nice little component conceptually that's in the bill that tries to get the money that's supposed to go to teachers. I like that idea. And were this a different bill in a different time and a different discussion, I'd certainly be eager to work through that. If you're getting rid of $150 million and all in arbitrarily, you can contemplate that each teacher's salary is in the ballpark of, we'll say $100,000 with all of the benefits and everything. It's less than that, but I'm just going round numbers for easy math. That's 1,500 teachers. So what are you doing with a $150 million cut? You can't cut that amount in paper, Mr. Chairman. You can't. If you cut $150 million, you're going to cut about 1,500 teachers. That's the way the system works. That's the way the model works. If anyone has any other presumptions of something different, I'm curious to hear where the money would come from. Because again, I've been studying this model for a decade. I assumed there was fluff. I assumed there was some place to make some efficiencies and improve things. And Mr. Chairman, the only place that I can find that is clearly constitutional, it is, that would clearly save money, it will, and will clearly anger the heck out of this chamber, absolutely, is to consolidate districts and schools. I can tell you how much that'll save. You give me what you want, I'll tell you how much money you'll save. And you'll all be mad about it. That's why we haven't done it in 10 years, Mr. Chairman. It's constitutional, though. It's efficient. Probably gets a better education in a lot of circumstances. Unfortunately, those kids have to sit on a school bus and they don't get that community that we all value. So we can do things constitutionally, but we'll suffer for that. These cuts will not be constitutional. I swore an oath to uphold the Constitution. I like this Wyoming Constitution. It strongly prioritizes, Mr. Chairman, education in this state. And I moved back to this state after my wife and I's adventures leaving for a decade. We came back here for the education system. Of course, to see our families too, to be home again. But we wanted to raise our family here because we knew this education system was second to none. I want it to continue to be, Mr. Chairman. This amendment is counter to that, on and against.
Senator Scott.
Mr. Chairman, let me just respond, since we're debating the amendment, to a couple of the points. First, on the constitutionality. Remember the provision in Article 7, Section 9, about an efficient system of public schools. That's what we're talking about. That particular provision was cited in the Campbell decisions. Supreme Court knows it's there. We'll recognize it. And specifically, I believe, has used the technique itself of looking at what the districts are actually doing to see what's cost-based and what's reasonable. You've got to keep that in mind. This is a constitutional proposition. Second point I would make. Teacher salaries are a driver, Mr. Chairman, but they are not the driver. The majority of the employees of the school systems in Wyoming are not teachers. And I've seen two different figures. They both reach that conclusion. And I've got to sort out what's the difference because they are slightly different. But both of them, a majority of the employees are not teachers. And that's something to remember too, that as we make some reductions and some increases, we are making the increases in the teachers. We are putting the emphasis back on the teachers because they are the frontline employees who are carrying out the education system, who are actually teaching our kids. They're the most important element of our education system, and this amendment protects them.
Senator Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple things I'd like to address here. We talk about the constitutionality and the need for equality in the education. I toured a school district on the edge of my district recently and saw some things in there that were just absolutely amazing. Some really good things in a school district. One of the things that we talked about with these folks was the difference between necessities and niceties. And the lady that I was talking with didn't really understand my point. I said, well, you have a real nice football stadium here with AstroTurf. She said, yes, we do. We're very proud of it. I said, we'd like to have a football field, period. I kind of drove it home a little bit to her, but you know, in that same school district, they have one big, beautiful building with 2 grades of kindergarten in it. We're not even going to be able to in one of our districts, maybe 2 of them, to afford preschool, let alone 2 grades of kindergarten. So the equality in the schools that the good senator over here is talking about is not there under the system that's there now. So we all know the problems. We know the questions in constitutionality, and he brought them up very clearly. But what he didn't bring was a solution to the problem. This is maybe not a perfect solution, this amendment, but I think it's a really good start, and it's someplace for us to start looking. Those 81 ghost teachers, if you will, those salaries are not going to the teachers right now. So if we can cut those salaries or divert them back to the teachers, I think that's the right thing to do. They're not being used as they're designed to be used. They're not being used as the model says they're to be used. They're being misused by certain school districts. One district to the west of here, where the good senator is actually from, last year I made a swim meet there with my grandson. And what a facility, beautiful, beautiful facility. And one of the things talking to some of the folks there that they were complaining about was the fact that they had $1 million some in lighting for the parking lot, almost right at 2 million if I remember right. And the parking lot hadn't been finished yet. They were really disappointed in that. And I was thinking, my God, what could we do with $2 million in our school or 2 or 3 of the other schools in our district? And so we understand the problem. We understand the constitutionality questions that we have to address, but they're not, nobody else is bringing solutions. This is a possible solution. It's something we need to look at very closely. Thank you, sir.
A standing committee amendment number 1, Senate File 143, Senator Wasberger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Having served years ago as the House Education Chairman when this model was adopted, that was a major impact in that session with the good former senator from Cody, who I am dear friends with. And so he and I actually pushed this through, and ultimately in Campbell 4, the Supreme Court declared the funding formula constitutional. When we did that, every time we did something in the model, we had a list of what it would do to every school district in the state, whether it increased funds or lost funds for all the 48 districts. And my question is to the good chairman of Senate Education, why don't we have that here? Why don't we have a list that shows us what the cuts are going to be to each individual school district? And I can tell you easily that, at least in my district, the funding model is essentially built on an average daily membership, or ADM. It's built on what it costs to educate a student in the state of Wyoming for every day that they're in the state of Wyoming. And so what I can do when I look at a total cut, because I have 10% of the total students in the state in Campbell County School District, whatever that cut is, I can look at it and say, well, it's 10% of that. So if you're talking about $150 million, you're talking about $15 million to my district, at least. And so their total budget is about $134 million. So what will 15 million do to my school district? And in any school district budget, 85% of the budget is people. In Wyoming, no matter what district you are in of the 48 districts, the school district is one of the top 3 employers. In Campbell County School District is the number 2 employer behind the hospital. So somewhere or another of that $15 million, 85% of that has to be people that lose a job. That's what we're talking about here in every community. And so I would ask the good education chairman, why don't we have a list that tells us what each district faces? Where is that list? Everybody that's here that's a veteran of this legislature knows what I'm talking about. Where is that? Why don't we have that? So I would ask the chairman if we could get that before third reading.
Senator Scott.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Chairman, yes, we will get that. And I have warned the LSO that there would be a demand for that and we'd have to have it. And frankly, I have not pushed it. They said to me, well, we don't want to put it together till you see what you're really going to do so you can tell what's going on. And it is a lot of work to get it put together. But they can do it and they will. And frankly, Mr. Chairman, I've not pushed that. I have not wanted to see it myself. And the reason is, I've been here before. Those lists come out. Everybody says, is my district being benefited or hurt? And they vote accordingly. And we're at the point where we need to keep our eye on the ball to look at the overall system. And is it what's best for our kids? Is it within the realm of what can be afforded? You have to look at both. And I'll guarantee you one thing about that list. With this amendment and this bill, your school district will show its revenues declining. That's part and parcel of what's going on here, and I'll explain a little more later on. But I hope you will all resist the temptation to say, gee, is my district taking a cut? Yes, I can guarantee to you it will. Is it taking more of a cut than the next guy over? That's what I'm asking us to resist. Because I think they're all being treated fairly, but they're all going to take a cut. And if we allow parochialism to dominate, we will fail to fix the school system. And we will destroy our finances. And your constituents will be mad at you for forcing a tax increase, and they will be mad at you for destroying the value of the school system both, because that's where we're headed if we don't start getting things done this time. Because we will then drive over that cliff, and they'll see a 30% cut, and then we'll see a big tax increase, and we'll see a big cut both, and you'll have succeeded in angering all your constituents. That is not something that a representative of the people wants to do.
Yes, Senator McEwen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The definition of lunacy, following the same course of action year in and year out and expecting a different result. This model is taking us over a cliff. My constituents, the guys who pull coal out of the ground and bag groceries, want the school system cut. And before we came down here, we went through some schools. And this is a fun game. There's already 20 kids in the average room in a K through 12 schoolhouse where I'm from. I can only speak for the district that I'm around. So to me, we're already at 20, but we still keep the ghost teachers. And I listened to the superintendent describe what they do with the money. Didn't realize we were sitting in the room and why they had to have it. I don't have all the answers for this, but I do have this answer. If we stay hiding behind, we're afraid of the Supreme Court to change this because there's precedence that says we have to drive off a cliff no matter what, we're just going to drive off the cliff. At the end of the day, this has to be changed. There can't be plasma cutters hidden in the back of bus barns. So we got through our use or lose spending. We're not even talking about any of this. We have yet to talk really in depth of where money goes for administration, free vehicles. Ask somebody to show you the P cards at a school district, the personal travel cards and the things they get to use. That's locked up in a safe and nobody wants to share that either. Nobody in here is suggesting we cut teachers, but that is the answer every time. I sat at a school board meeting and I listened to them say, if you cut 10% out of our budget, we will have to shut down 2 schools. Now, I'm not real bright, but there's not that many schools in the district. And it's going to get rid of all these teachers. It's building fear. If you cut us, your kids will get dumber. We will not have good teachers. We finally have something, at least on the floor, that's taking care of teachers and nothing else. And that's probably all we need to take care of, where the rubber meets the road right now. But I will tell you, if we keep going the way we're going off a cliff. And we can hide behind everything and say, oh, Campbell this, Campbell that. It won't matter in 6 years if we don't fix something. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Ellis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is an important topic. So I know that, we spend a lot of time sometimes on things that might be perceived as being silly bills, but I can tell you, this is the conversation. Before I begin my remarks, I just want to make it clear, I have 3 kids in public schools, and when our state shut down last year, my husband and I found ourselves in a situation where we had to more or less provide most of their educational instruction. And our teachers, I think was a real eye-opening experience for a lot of families in Wyoming about just what's happening with their kids, what they're learning, some of the challenges that teachers face. And I was really proud of the fact that Wyoming's one of those states that stepped up and found a way to make it work, to get teachers back in the classroom and kids back in the classroom. Because as a mom, a working mom, I can tell you, my husband and I contemplated maybe one of us needing to step away from work if schools remain closed. So the teachers in our schools certainly have stepped up in a very important way, and I want them to know I appreciate that. I think most of us in here don't like the conversation we're having to have. I think most of us would like to have days where the price of oil is strong, where we have a robust coal industry, but that's just not the reality we're faced with. And so as we look at our constitutional obligation when it comes to education, we hear this all the time. What does the Constitution say? What do the Campbell's decisions say? And we hear the words complete, uniform, adequate, and efficient. And over the years, with the recalibration discussion, we do talk about the uniformity, the completeness, and the adequacy. But one piece of that is missing, and that's the word efficiency. And when we looked at the Campbell decisions, this was an issue that the court actually paid quite a bit of attention to in Campbell 1. They wanted to know what the framers of our Constitution meant when they drafted the Constitution. So if you look at Campbell 1, they pulled out a dictionary from 1889 to understand what the framers understood that word to mean. And then they looked at a contemporary version, and it means efficient without waste. And I don't know that any time that I've had this conversation about education funding that has ever played a prominent role in any kind of conversation. It's always, what's the wish list? What does it cost? And we have to pay for it. So when we talk about evidence-based, there's no doubt in my mind, we have evidence and data coming out of our ears. We have information about teacher salaries, principal salaries, what the model provides, how much is above that, what the average is. We are looking at this with all of that information in mind. So I would argue that we are doing our due diligence by looking at all that evidence. It's just, what do we want to do with it? And that's why we're having so much debate and time talking about it today. I want to be sensitive to the fact that in our state, we value local control, and that's been a hallmark of our education system for years. But if you look at the history of what our requirement is and how that relationship between the state legislature and our local school boards are, I think we're a little out of whack. So back to our, a prior senator talked about a calendar we received that has some really neat historical information. And so looking at January 15th, the Supreme Court of Wyoming declared Wyoming's public education funding unconstitutional, and that was in 1890. We have been having this conversation for a while. But if you look back at what was happening then, there was a lot of confusion about whose role was it to provide this education, local communities or the state. Our territorial legislature felt that it didn't have the power to create or establish schools. And so it took some legislative acts for them to finally grapple with the fact that they wanted to have that ability. So in 1873, they passed a comprehensive school code, and it mandated local property taxation for the support of schools. According to the Campbell case, this is where the research was discussed. During the territorial period, the only source of revenue for schools was from county and district taxation. So the abilities of county to support education, though, were left largely in local controlled hands, and it varied. There were some county superintendents at the time and local school boards that were hiring unqualified teachers and purchasing inadequate textbooks. And in 1873, the legislature required the development of a territorial institute to train teachers because they were so concerned about the lack of quality teachers back then. But by 1889, there were counties that were reporting their state of education, some of them boasting excellent facilities with libraries, modern methods of delivering education, and the best teachers money could buy. Other counties, however, failed to report, and research revealed there was little commitment to education with consequence inadequacies in all areas. And so by the time we got to 1890, the state really had to wrestle with this notion of what it was going to do, rely very much on local control or have a statewide system. So that's why our Constitution is framed the way it is, providing great strength in the state of Wyoming to make these decisions. However, we recognize that we derive a lot of the funding for education from local property tax, but this was always viewed as a Wyoming resource that should be benefiting all of Wyoming children. And so that's why we have the system we have today. And so the framers did not prohibit a local role in the administration of education. It is our job as a legislature to define that role. And so when we look at the data that we see today, and if we're not happy with our block grant funding model, it is certainly within our purview to redirect course. And so that's what this legislation seeks to do. One issue that we've talked about is our ranking on national assessment scores. We talk a lot about the ranking. We're ranked 5th, we're ranked 6th. Rankings are one thing, but if you look at what those NAEP scores indicate, we should all be concerned. If you look at NAEP scores for 4th grade reading, 73% of our students are at a basic level and 41% are at a proficient level. So I ask you, as a mom, am I happy with 41% of our students being proficient? No, I'm not. Looking at other scores, I think we should also be concerned, particularly if you look at Native American reading scores. 85% are not reading at a proficient level. And so I don't mean to disparage our school systems and our teachers. It's a tough job. It's incredibly important and difficult work. But if we're ever going to expect different outcomes, we have to ask, is there a better way of doing this? And so that's what we're trying to do with this legislation and this recalibration bill, is to redirect resources that we know are critical in these economic times to areas where we think they'll have the greatest impact. And so that's why you'll see the categorical grant created for teacher salaries and an increase for those salaries, because we want to ensure that as local decisions are being made about how to direct those funds, that those critical dollars are going where they should be, and that's with kids. And so I want to just emphasize that, I do have some other concerns. When you look at the spending level, since we're talking about evidence-based, our model provides on average 11% higher, or excuse me, what's happening in actuality is our model has a base level allocated for teacher salaries. In actuality, teachers are earning about 11% higher than that model. Library and media, tech, secretarial staff, they're all in that range. But when you start looking at principals, it's 14% higher than the model. Assistant principals, 22% higher. Superintendents, 24% higher. Assistant superintendents and business managers, 25% higher. Mr. Chairman, it is our duty to look at these numbers, and we have, and we're responding within our constitutional obligation to be more involved in looking at our basket of goods and how we're delivering education in Wyoming. I've also had some concerns with how we allocate funding for our athletics and extracurriculars. Those activities were important for me when I was in high school. I was a high school athlete. I did speech and debate. There's no question there's value in those programs. But when we talk about the equity piece, we equitably provide that opportunity in theory to all of our students. But in reality, we know only a handful of those students reap the benefits of those particular programs. And so when we look at areas where we can fine tune and maybe find some efficiencies, I think the extracurricular activities is a very important and appropriate place for us to look in our model. So Mr. Chairman, this discussion just kind of skims the surface, but I want to assure members of this body that your education committee, and I know other members in this room, have been looking thoroughly at this model and trying to examine our duty and making sure that we are providing for that efficiency, while also making sure that we're fulfilling our other constitutional duties. And I wish we weren't in this situation, Mr. Chairman, but we are. And so I can't emphasize it enough. If we do nothing this year and wait for some kind of turnaround in our economy, hope, hopes aren't plans. If we do nothing, we would face significant cuts in education in a couple of years, up to 30%. And so while unpleasant, I just want to keep in mind that we're the actual dollars of what we're talking about. We talk a lot about the 10% reduction, possibly $100 million reduction, 150 million. At the end of the day, this is still more than half of our state's budget. And we are looking at going from revenue that's maybe in the $1.5 billion range to 1.4 billion. So the question is, can we do education for 1.35, 1.4 billion? I think we can. And I think this is a good start for us to figure out how to direct those resources. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, Senator Salazar has been very patient, as has Senator Schuler, and then we'll get to Senator Hicks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a couple of comments to make. You know, as a freshman in the Senate, I was going to start enjoying my time as a senator from the House, and then I was told I was going to be placed on the Education Committee. But, you know, I will say this. I deliberately, in 2019, spent a couple months as a substitute teacher in my school district for the specific purpose of if this day came. I wanted to see what was happening in our classrooms, and I will tell you what I saw. I saw incredible people teaching our kids in incredible circumstances. When I was a substitute teacher, I was dealing with about 80% of the classroom that all they wanted to do was learn. But there was that 20% that didn't really want to be there some of the time. And so a lot of it was simply controlling the classroom. And I say that because to say this, our teachers are incredible, absolutely incredible. I wish we weren't in the situation that we are in. What elected official wants this conversation? Truly. None of us are going to get any praise about it. And when I walked into the Senate Education Committee, I made it clear to the committee that I had some specific issues that I was very concerned about. One of them was special ed. I don't believe we should touch special ed. I didn't want to, I also made it clear that on teacher salaries, I don't want teacher salaries cut. I made that clear. Summer programs for children who need that extra help to get to the same level as their classmates on reading. I don't want that touched. I think that these proposals are necessary to save this state. Now, one of the things that the emails that I get is raise taxes. If you really want to solve this problem, it's just an additional cent. It's just a little bit more. Well, you saw me yesterday fighting for DD waivers. You saw me yesterday fighting for home services for the elderly and foster parents and veterans. Are those additional taxes going to go to education? I will tell you that in my Senate district, I have single parent moms, single parent families who just want to put food on the table. I have working families living paycheck to paycheck, one crisis away. I have a lot of retirees and veterans. A tax is going to kill them. And I wasn't sent here to destroy those families with additional taxes. So the best I can do is to choose those areas in the education arena that I feel strongly about that we should not touch, like special education, like teacher salaries, like the summer program. I think all of you, most of you have seen some of the administrative costs and the salaries that are incredibly out of range of most of my constituents in Little Pavilion or Du Bois. And when I have town hall meetings, and I did have them regularly, those salaries were like being on the planet Mars. And we need to look at those. The bottom line is this is what we need to do. But I do want to continue discussion on the transportation formula for my rural community. And I want a discussion on the long-term solution of education funding, because all we do is knee-jerk reactions every year. I would dearly like, starting after this session, to start having a long-term solution on education funding. I think we need to do that. We owe it to our education community. We owe it to our kids. And I'm begging that we have that discussion, and I believe we will. I ask for your support on this amendment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good conversation. It's difficult for me as an educator to talk about cuts, but I did. I talked about cuts to everybody that in my county that I talked to. I said, everybody's going to get cut. School districts, I mean, you name it. But I said, here's the one thing, I guess, that gives me a little bit of pause with this amendment, is I think we kind of took the idea of local control away from our districts. You know, if you look at the governor's cuts, he went to each of the directors of his agencies and he said, hey, you know, you need to cut 10%. Kind of gave them the option to take a look around at where they needed to cut. And certainly he had the last say, as we do. But I think, you know, that we kind of took that away from our districts. Now, the last I talked to the superintendents in my county, you know, I said, you know, we kind of think it's probably going to be 6.5. And I said, so just be prepared, start looking around where you need to. I think every budget has some places they can cut. And as a teacher, I know that there's some waste in some districts, maybe some in more than others. There's places you can cut. You just have to look and you can find them. But, you know, I don't want to get to the point where, you know, if this was a 6.5 and this was kind of what we threw out there. And I do know that the JAC actually put out a letter to the superintendents and talked about what would a 16% cut do for your districts. And for our districts, I saw some of the letters and it would have been really devastating. So 6.5, I think we could have lived with. This is going to be a bit more. And I would like to actually know the actual percent exactly of what these cuts are going to be. Like, is it 10? Is it 12? Is it 14? Is it 9.5? I think we need to know that up front. But that's what I really have the most pause with, is that we took the control away from our school boards and our superintendents. And maybe we just don't have enough trust. Of course, they've had the ghost teachers and some other things out there. And of course, the superintendents are above the funding model. So maybe there's not a lot of trust. I do trust the folks that I'm aware of in our state, that they do a good job with their money. I guess the bottom line is, you know, will we get a better product with cuts? I don't think so. You know, I don't know what the data will show in a couple of years. I think raising the numbers in the elementary level, that's probably where we're going to see the most devastation, really, because the small class sizes there, it's really imperative. As a high school teacher, yeah, we can take more kids. I think you can take a few more at the high school, middle school, but I think at the elementary level, that's going to be a tough one. So even though I know as a teacher, we've got to make some cuts, we have, it's a budget thing and we have to do it. I just feel bad that we've kind of taken it out of the hands of our local superintendents and school boards and said, we can't trust you to maybe do what you need to do. And maybe, maybe that's where we've got to start is from there. But I appreciate the work that the Education Committee has done on this. I agree with a few things on here, but I don't agree with all of them. But anyway, that's my 2 cents. Thanks.
Senator Hicks.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity. We had some pretty good debate yesterday talking about how we should listen to the professionals and the experts in the field regarding healthcare issues. And so having the opportunity to sit on your recalibration committee for the last year, I just wonder why we don't accept the advice and the direction of those professionals that we paid millions of dollars for in recalibration to follow their recommendations and advice, because they're experts in the field. My colleague from Natrona County first hit it out. I think on page 3 of the report says, Wyoming, let's talk about evidence-based, because it really comes down to evidence-based. So what does the evidence show? And my colleague from Natrona County is exactly right. What the evidence showed, as according to the consultants, that the rate of improvement in our schools has not kept pace with the amount of money we spent. So let me boil that down. Just throwing money at this issue and a model hasn't worked for well for the state of Wyoming for a lot of reasons. That's pretty evidence-based. That's right from the professionals. That's what they said. So let's take the evidence-based just a little step further. In this bill, we had Dr. Lori Taylor come in, do a large economic analysis of what it was to cost out for each school district an economic analysis. That's called a hedonic wage index. It goes in there and looks at the cost of living index, a lot of other factors, proximity, and comes up with a number. So what did the recal committee do? They rejected it. And why? Because of the very reason that my colleague from Natrona County pointed out, because a couple of members on the recal got in there and they said, oh my gosh, that cuts my school district. And at the same time, they could look at the same empirical evidence-based data and say it's hurting the kids in another school district because they've had large expansions of industrial population. The demand for housing and groceries and gasoline has all increased, but we don't care about those kids, just the kids in my school district. In 2018, we had the same economists come in and do the hedonic wage index. And what did the Joint Education Committee do? They rejected it. Why did they reject it? Because my school district was going to get cut more than your school district. You want evidence-based? You want to listen to the professionals? You adopt the amendment on the hedonic wage index. That's the advice we've got. That's what the professional says. That's what the amendment does. So, Mr. Chairman, let's talk about evidence-based just a little further. Evidence-based is average classroom size in the state of Wyoming is 19.1 students. My colleague from Cheyenne did an excellent job showing where the disparity in is. That's evidence-based. So let's talk about evidence-based. Large schools, 21 kids per classroom. We have seen some improvement in our test scores. But the evidence is, it suggests we did that with 19.1 kids in our classrooms. That's evidence-based, Mr. Chairman. But at the end of the day, whether it's hedonic wage index, cost of living increase, making schools better, that's what we all want. What we know from the advice of the consultants is what we're doing is not giving us the bang for the buck. We know where a lot of this is. When you look at school administration and they spend 25%, 20 to 25% more than the model, is the model working? So let's talk about the model. We fund a model, folks. So again, what did this consultants do? They come in and they said, we're going to look at the best, the most highest improving schools within the state of Wyoming and the best schools in the state of Wyoming, and they picked 6 schools to look at that. The consultant, our experts that we pay a lot of money and advice for. And here's the interesting thing. They came back and they said, We picked the very smallest school in district in the state of Wyoming, Arvada Claremont. I think there's 148 kids in the whole school district. One of the most improved school districts in the state of Wyoming, the smallest. They looked at the second largest school district in the state of Wyoming and they said, they're one of the tops. So how could you, and here's the interesting thing that boggled my mind. You know what they found out of those 6 districts? They most closely followed the model. But the trouble is, we do not require school districts to follow the model. We do a block grant. And so consequently, through the block grant, we have superintendent salaries that are 25% higher than what we fund at the model, that are much higher than the regional average. We have chief finance officers that make 25% more than the model. And you know why? Because we fund a block grant. When the evidence shows that if we would follow the model, whether you're the smallest school district or the second biggest school district in the state of Wyoming, the model would work. We fund a model. The trouble is, we're getting threatened on occasion. We've had several threats and suggestions that if we don't fund the model, we're going to sue you. Well, how does that work if we don't fund the model and they don't even follow it anyway, folks? If we fund a model and we give it as a block grant and they pay 25% more for superintendents, 24% more for chief financial officers, we spend more on activities and we spend more on this. They don't follow the model. Why? Because we give it in a block grant. Evidence would suggest if you just follow the model, whether you're the smallest or the largest school district in the state of Wyoming, it works. We might have to really think this whole block grant concept because the evidence suggests maybe it's not working. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Nethercott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This has been really great. I just think that it's helpful to bring us back to where the conversation is today. The state has no money. I do believe that the stakeholders, that the students, the families, the parents, the teachers all understand that we are in a state of declining revenues. So I do think it's important that we focus on the place that we're in now, that there is an acceptance, I think generally, about the need to reduce the spending with education. Certainly we're getting caught up in some of those nuances for how those cuts take place, but I think it's important for the productivity of this conversation and the same arguments that I've heard year after year after year after year, that we focus on that common ground for where we're at with our citizens and our constituents, with the realization of declining revenues, of the loss of coal, and we recognize that we have to cut education. Both bodies agree. We're going to get there. We're going to work on it. This is hard. So I would ask for the interest for where we are as we focus on those pieces, understand where there's consensus and understand where there's not, because I clearly don't understand. I keep hearing the recitation of the last 20 years of education history, maybe even the last 150, which is helpful. And I know that it's an evidence-based model, further helpful, but let's really focus on what those disagreements are, because it's not clear to me. I think that there's likely more consensus if we can step away from the appearance of disagreement. That's the lawyer.
Okay, so we're still on standing committee amendment number 1, Senate File 143, Senator Landon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What was that bill in the amendment? I'm kidding. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wasn't going to get up, but now I am. I just a few bullet pieces of information. I am really glad that my friend from Baggs got an opportunity to serve on a recalibration committee. I think it was probably pretty eye-opening for him. I've served on 3, and I've spent the better part of my last 15 years on your education committees, learning and doing what we could with this system. And I just have some bullet points I'll share with you. First of all, if we want to have the system that we do in Wyoming, which keeps all of those schools open, it's going to be expensive. My friend from the Ivory Towers is exactly right. If we want to talk about efficiency, and be careful, because we probably don't want to talk about efficiency, because the best way to be efficient is to consolidate schools. We got buses nowadays that are hotspots. You could take your computer and our kids could have their homework done by the time they get to school every morning. And like me, they could ride a bus for 35 minutes and be to school. And we all know a lot of schools out there where if you bus 35 minutes, you can get to another one. In some cases, you can get to one in 6 miles or 10 miles. So that's efficient. I don't think we want to go there, and this doesn't reflect that. Here's another bullet point for you. For the past 5 years on the Appropriations Committee and the Education Committee, I have heard testimony from throughout the state that we're beginning to really have problems getting teachers. And we're having even bigger problems getting administrators. So what this amendment would do is cap administrators at an arbitrary level. And we learned this morning that we're not even going to allow the school districts any flexibility on that. I'm just going to tell you, they're looking for a superintendent in this district right here. You offer them 130, they're not going to take it. You're not going to get somebody to take over this district for that salary. It's all market driven, you guys. It's just a market driven system out there. Let's take a young lady who has just graduated from the University of Wyoming, and she has an opportunity to teach where the vice president lives, or she can go 35 miles down the road and make the same salary. 90% of the time, she's going 30 miles down the road to teach in that bigger environment. So that's why I just got a chart from one of my friends which indicated that our school districts are above the model. Well, that's why they're above the model. If you're going to get somebody to go to some of those towns that I've alluded to out there across our state, you have to pay them market value. Otherwise, they're going to stay on the Front Range, or they're going to stay down in the valley because they're not going to come to some of those districts. So that's market driven, and that pushes the cost a little bit. My final bullet is that what we're doing with this amendment, and by the way, I'm going to support it because I appreciate the work and I know that we've got to do some work on this, guys, but repeatedly, and again this time, my district's going to get hammered. Our big districts are going to get hammered with this amendment. And it doesn't set real well. I'm really having to swallow hard on that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any further discussion? Senator Cooper.
I'm going to ask some questions with a novel thought. I'm going to ask him regarding the amendment. A couple of things I'd like to have explained real when you have a second here, Senator. The rolling average number, the 3-year rolling average, we're removing that on this amendment back to take care of the pre-COVID, and then the rolling average in the future would come back into the play. Is that, it just goes away? It goes away completely. Okay, could you explain transportation to me, that there's a reduction in transportation after a couple of years? And then I also need an explanation of the central office cuts and where you're headed with those, please, if you get a minute. And to the good senator over here, yes, our kids could do their homework on the bus because they're going to have 2 to 2.5 hours each way. So there's plenty of time. Thank you.
Hey, Senator Scott, let's bring it home.
Well, Mr. Chairman, let me try to answer those last 2 questions. The way this is structured with the amendment, we will go to, you'll be based on the pupils you had in the most recent year. We're doing something slightly different because of COVID for the first year. Because frankly, the year we're in, the COVID had some wild effects. So we're going, using a different base year. But then we will go just to the prior year. So we will give up the luxury of the 3-year rolling average to make it easier to deal with a decrease in enrollment. That's too expensive. It's not a fundamental provision in terms of getting the kids the education that the model and our basket of goods demands. It's an administrative convenience that is quite convenient. It's easier to adjust to a decline if you do it gradually. But we're at the point where we can't afford that. So that is a change we're making. With regard to the transportation, the provision in the bill is we go to the year before COVID, entirely before COVID, and then take 90% of that. That's the block grant amount for transportation. Can't go over that. But that's for 2 years. And then what happens? There is a sunset on that particular provision. Now that sunset means that if we don't pass another bill in 2 years, we'll cease reimbursing for transport. None of us are going to do that. That's a classic use of a legislative sunset. You say, look, we got a problem. We're going to go out and fix it. And there's a provision in the bill, not in the amendment, but in the bill. But Mr. Chairman, I'll talk about it now because it relates to the provision in the amendment. Provision in the bill that says that your Joint Education Committee will go out and try to develop a formula for reimbursing on transportation. Because the existing system is they spend it, we pay for it, there's no control on it. And anybody that's had any experience with large organizations, whether public or private, somebody else is paying for you doing something you want to do. You do a lot more of it than if you have to pay for it yourself. You're up against some kind of a limit. And we've just blown our transportation expenses through the ceiling. So there's a 2-year provision to get the spending under control until your Joint Education Committee can come up with a formula that will avoid this unlimited checkbook phenomenon. Mr. Chairman, the business about the districts and the consolidation and that sort of thing, I will reach later on when we explain the bill itself, when we voted on the standing committee amendment. So I'll hold that. Mr. Chairman, with that, I would call for the question.
Okay, very good. Seeing no further discussion, the question is on Senator Scott's motion to adopt Standing Committee Amendment number 1, the Senate File 143. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed say no. Motion carries. We're back on the bill. Senator Scott.
Two additional features of the bill that I need to mention. One, we've heard about, we've basically been debating the bill on the Standing Committee Amendment, which is fine because most of the bill was designed to be amended. It was amended and it was appropriate to do that. We didn't get into as much. We did mention it some. On page 48, lines 12 through 23, we are making the teacher reimbursement here in the model a categorical grant that can't be used for anything else. You could put money into it the way it's written, but you can't take money out of it and use it for somewhere else. That is a violation of the total local control. Plain and simple, make no mistake about it. We are doing that because our experience is if we don't do that, money moves from the primary mission of education to the peripheries, to administration. That's why we're way over model on administration. It moves to activities. That's why we're way over on activities. We're going to improve the quality of classroom instruction. We've got to focus the resources. That's what that categorical grant does. And if we don't do that, I would submit to you what we'll see right across the state, in most of the districts, is administration activities will stay right where they are, and the classroom teachers will take a hit. And that we don't want to do. So that is a key. And that's there, you can see it, page 48, lines 12 through 23. Mr. Chairman, let me try to put this whole bill in some perspective. We've heard some rhetoric both on and off the floor. You'd think that the world was coming to an end. I would submit to you that it is not. Our finances may come to an end, but that's a different issue. Mr. Chairman, let's talk about the financial situation here. This bill will reduce, and we'll compute it again, but there was a request earlier. What are we really doing? We're spending vicinity 1.5 billion with a B every year on K-12 education. It is the largest item in our expenditures to state and local governments in Wyoming, far and away, as it should be, because this is the most important thing we do. What this bill does, when you add up all the places where we've decreased the spending in the model and the place where we've increased by raising the teacher's salary. I'm proud we did that, because that means we're looking at the fundamental thing that we're doing with this education. But we're looking at a reduction of approximately 10% in that 1.5 billion. 150 million, give or take 5 million on this. We're not precise. We haven't focused on the finances as much as we might have. And we've been running off the sheets that y'all have, and they haven't been quite updated for all the nuances we put in and taken out. But it's a 10% reduction. Mr. Chairman, and I'm going to show my age at this point. I'm an old geezer. I've had 48 years experience dealing with large governmental organizations. 5 years with the federal government in Washington, D.C., operations research analyst, how I started out as a budget officer in the water program for a while. And 43 years here in this legislature. It is my observation in the nature of human organizations that in the good times, we all get a little fat, get a little lazy, continue doing some things that are convenient, but are not as efficient as they might be. Continue efforts that were a good idea once maybe, but no longer are, where progress has been made, the world has changed, we ought to change what we're doing, and it's comfortable not to. And one of the advantages of an economic downturn is it makes you focus back on what's important and focus on the efficiency so that you're doing what you need to without wasting resources. And we're talking about a series, they're large organizations on any scale. You know, it's not in the scale of a Colorado or a New York or something, but they're good-sized organizations, and they suffer all the weaknesses of human organizations. Mr. Chairman, I suggest to you that if it's properly implemented, every school district in this state can find 10%. They haven't had a real challenge to their budget yet, unlike the rest of state government. They can find 10%. I think if this bill passes all the way through and gets the governor's signature as is and goes into law, that we will see a much more efficient school system, that we will see one that does a better job because it will be refocused on our core mission, which is teaching the kids. Does a better job in educating our children. And that's the perspective I think we need to put on this. We do have to watch out for the risk of going over a fiscal cliff in the future. The sooner we make these are relatively easy reductions. You wouldn't think of it hearing all the weeping and wailing that we do, but these are relatively easy reductions. Nothing compared to what we might have to do if we kick the can down the road a couple of times and we go over that fiscal cliff and cut us 30%. So that's the perspective of this. 10% reduction, a refocusing on our core mission that will improve our instruction. Mr. Chairman, this is a bill you can vote for and go home to your constituents and tell them you did the right thing for the state, for the education of its children, and for the preservation of fiscal sanity in Wyoming. Mr. Chairman, I urge an aye vote in the bill.
Any further discussion on this topic, Senator Rothfuss?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And we can all go home and tell our constituents that, and honestly, I hope it's true. You know, I so often don't want things to go the way I think they're going to go. And this is one of those cases. I hope that by decimating the education budget, origin of the word decimate is to cut by 10%. By decimating the education budget, that they will learn to focus more on education and do a better job. That would be a great outcome. The implication is they've been doing a lousy job and that they just need to have fewer so that they can have that focus. That's not a view I share. But again, we can hope that's true and we can tell our constituents that, and perhaps they will agree. We can also hope that somehow a 10% budget cut does not lead to job loss. I don't know how that can take place. I don't know how we can have less than 1,000 teachers or educators or education employees at our school districts lose their jobs and achieve $135 million in cuts. I don't know how, again, having looked at this. I don't know how that can happen. But again, it's very possible, Mr. Chairman, that I'm just missing something in the budget. My suggestion is not to believe me on where those cuts would come from. I don't know why you would, because you have better resources available. You have better information available. You have your own districts. You have your superintendents. You have your business managers. Some of you have multiple superintendents and multiple business managers. You all know teachers. You all know administrators. So after we take this vote, call them and call the ones you trust and say, how are we going to do this? And in fact, we did get a sheet circulated that gives those numbers. I appreciate the good senator for sending that around. And they'll know already because they'll probably have done this calculation and they'll be able to tell you, and they'll probably be able to name people you know that will be how they will cut. And that's the reality. And I understand the desire to paint a positive vision on this. I would want to paint a positive vision too. I want to believe the good tall senator. I want everything he said to be factually accurate. But I don't see how it can. And that's perhaps just an area where we'll disagree. We'll see how the future plays out. And we'll see what reality shows us. And it is true that the world is not going to end. There's no question the world's not going to end. We'll still have an education system. We'll just have one that moves back towards mediocrity because we won't have as many teachers as we need. We won't have the resources that we need to perform at the level we're performing at right now, which is quite exceptional. Of course, it can get better, Mr. Chairman. Of course, we can do better with efficiencies. There's no doubt about it. But the idea that somehow cutting resources can lead to better performance, I don't know any circumstance where we've really seen that demonstrated. I'm looking for one case study where a business, for example, said, you know what our problem is? Too much revenue. Let's cut. Let's eliminate 10% of our revenue. We'll be more focused. It doesn't happen in the business world. Reinvestment's typically what you do when you want to perform better. And that's what we should be doing with education. And Mr. Chairman, the last point I want to make is the idea that we have no choice once again. And we've discussed, you know, if I'm going to stand here and propose that we not adopt this, shouldn't I offer a plan? Well, Mr. Chairman, I have tried to offer plans, and those plans time and again are defeated. And some of those plans are in a chamber that we're not supposed to refer to at this point in time. And what it comes down to is that there is, as we know, a revenue alternative. And we don't have to and wouldn't, hopefully, tax those individuals that are our most vulnerable. Of course, we don't have to do that. There's so much taxing capacity in the state, and I don't know if everyone has seen the taxing capacity study that was done by one of our community colleges. If you haven't, please, I implore you, read it. That's the favor I want you to do because I know how this vote's going to turn out. Maybe 2, maybe 3, I don't know. We'll see. But what I really want to ask you, Mr. Chairman, and everybody else in here is to take an hour of your time. That's all, and I know we're all busy. And read the tax capacity study that lays out alternatives. Because that's just basically a book of solutions that we could opt for instead of this decimation. On and against the bill, let's come up with an alternative solution, Mr. Chairman.
Any further discussion? Okay, Senator Wasserberger.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Number of comments that I'd like to address to my good friend from Carbon County. I think a few years ago when I was on the recalibration committee, the issue was how many districts are actually following the model. And if I remember correctly, it was 98%. So it was very close to 100%. So districts are following the model. The next thing I'd like to talk about is our NAEP scores. National Assessment of Educational Progress. It is called the nation's report card. Wyoming, when I looked it up this year, was 6th. And you know, we were all very excited when the University of Wyoming girls basketball team won the Mountain West. Wouldn't it be something amazing if our football team was ranked 6th in the country? How proud of that would we be? So our educational system is one of the best in the United States. And that's what NAEP is. That's people recognize that test as the test. Next, I'd like to talk about the sheet that I sent to you by email. And so I'm looking at my district, and remember we talked about Campbell County School District having 10% of the total student enrollment in the state. And so as you look at that, Campbell County will actually have a cut of 9%. But if you look all the way down on that list, Sheridan number 3 has a 0% cut. There's some strange things going on. And guess what? It's always been that way when we've looked at these numbers over the years. Every cut hits differently. So if you're from Bighorn, Bighorn number one has a almost 35% cut. So typically in your budget, when you do a budget, I used to teach master's classes for young principals getting their master's degree. And so I taught budgeting. And so typically what you do when you're looking at a teacher is an average teacher with benefits right now is costing my district about $80,000. You throw in benefits, retirement, health insurance, and then the salary. That's kind of what it's at, or it's might be a little higher than that this year. So divide 80,000 into 12.2 million. That's 156 teachers. That's what it takes to make that cut. Remember, I told you that 85% of any school district's budget is people. So if we're going to talk about cutting groundskeepers who make a lot less than the teachers do, there's going to be a lot more groundskeepers cut. So, Mr. Chairman, on and against the amendment.
Okay, we are on the bill. Any further discussion? Seeing none, the question is, when the committee of the whole rises to report, the question is on Senator Scott's motion that when the committee of the whole rises to report, do so with a favorable recommendation on Senate File 143. All those in favor say aye. All opposed say no. That motion carries. Senate File 143 is passed committee of the whole. The next Senate file for our consideration is Senate File 114. The reading clerk will read it in the Senate file.
Senate File 114, State Land Leases, sponsored by Senator Boner, an act relating to state lands. It was referred to Committee Number 5, which turned to committee recommendation that it do pass amended. Ayes Senators Boner, Bouchard, French, Cost, and Wasserberger. Senator Boner, Chairman.
What is your pleasure, Senator Boner?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that when the committee of the whole rises to report, do so with a favorable recommendation in Senate File 114. I'll refer to myself to explain the bill. There's also a standing committee amendment. I ask that it be read in at this time.
Senate File 114, Standing Committee Amendment Number 1, page 1, line 8, delete.
Senator Boner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move standing committee amendment number 1, Senate File 114, and ask the body to vote no. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a committee of the whole amendment that will get the bill up to snuff. For reference, you do have a handout which I gave out last night. If you want to rummage for that, that will show the effect of the committee of the whole amendment. So for now, I ask you vote no on the standing committee amendment.
Question's been called. All those, please remember, he asked to vote no on this. It's your choice still, though. All those in favor of amendment, standing committee amendment number 1 to Senate File, I got to figure out 114. Say aye. All those opposed? No. That was a pretty weak no. Could we have a little better no? Thank you. Motion has failed.
Okay.
Yes, one moment. Senator Perkins,
Mr. Chairman.
you sure may.
Thank you. I just want to reminder that third reading amendment budget amendments are due, or the requests have to be in by 5 o'clock today. I mean, you can continue to work on perfecting those, but you got to get that concept and you got to get those amendments in, those requests in by 5 o'clock today. Just wanted to give you a reminder in case it slipped your mind. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Boner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's a committee of the whole amendment. I ask that to be read in.
Senate File 114, Committee of the Whole Amendment Number 1, delete thee.
Senator Boner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move committee of the whole amendment number 1 to Senate File 114 and ask for the body's favorable consideration. Ladies and gentlemen, the committee of the whole amendment is basically the bulk of the bill, so we'll just go ahead and discuss it right now, if that's okay. So what this bill does is it deals primarily with the process our state lands office goes through in leasing land, particularly vacant land. There's been an issue recently, several issues pop up throughout the state where we've had some very tense, tough decisions have put our state lands office and ultimately our board of land commissioners in a tough spot. And so what we're looking here to do is clarify some very old archaic language and provide clear direction for how these situations are going to play out while still giving ultimate discretion to that board of land commissioners. So what it does is there's two concepts when we talk about inuring the greatest benefit to trust beneficiaries, which is an important part or the vital part of considering how you lease these state lands. And so there's two primary ways you think about that. And the obvious one is you want the most money, right? So that's why we have a competitive bidding process. That's why we have even a concept of a live auction here in some limited circumstances in this bill. But there's also a strong consideration towards who's going to take care of that property, who's going to manage it for long-term benefit and make sure that it's well taken care of. So you see these other concept in our statutes of who's closest to the property in question. The assumption being that the closer you are to the property, the more likely you are to actively manage it in a competent manner. So what this does, Mr. Chairman, it elevates what's always been in our statutes. Frankly, it hasn't always been followed. This idea of a preference, especially if you're an adjoining landowner. So it makes it very clear. We define what preference is, and it says that if you're an adjoining landowner, you're going to have an opportunity to match a bid for vacant land. And if there's two adjoining landowners, they're going to go to a live auction if they're both competing over the same parcel. That's very important. You think about how tense and troublesome that situation is when you have two neighbors competing for that same vacant piece of land. And so the idea of a live auction at least has an element of one party voluntarily stepping back, and we're not forcing our board of land commissioners to referee those almost impossible situations. So that's what the bill does, and the committee of the whole amendment basically does. There's a few other features in there, such as a required notice. If there's a vacant land that comes up, you have to notify all the adjoining landowners, for example, and we define vacant land and preference. So that's the committee of the whole amendment, and it basically explains the bill. I'll stand for questions on the committee of the whole amendment.
Any questions on committee of the whole amendment? Question been called. All those in favor of committee of the whole amendment 1 to Senate File 14, please say aye. 114. I'm sorry if I didn't say that correctly. Let me refer to that. Committee of the whole amendment, Senate File 114. All those opposed, nay. Motion carries. We're on to the bill. Senator Boner.
Mr. Chairman, that basically explains the bill. I'll stand for any further questions.
Any questions on the bill? Do I hear a question?
Question.
Question's been called. We're on the bill. All those in favor of Senate File 114. I think I said that wrong. Let me try that again. All those in favor of the motion. Let me get the right one here. Where is it here? Sorry. All those in favor of Senate File 114 to the committee of the whole, please say aye. All those in favor, please vote. If you're in favor, okay, let's try this again. All those in favor of Senate File 114 to the committee of the whole.
Mr. Chairman, somebody made a motion on the bill, so.
Oh, all those in favor of the motion. Yes, all those in favor of Senator Boner's motion. I'll get this right. All those in favor of Senator Boner's motion, that when the committee of the whole report, they report in favor of Senate File 114, please vote aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. I wanted to waste a little more time up here. It's kind of fun. Thank you. Motion carries. So next bill for your reference is Senate File 99. Will the reading clerk please read the bill?
Senate File 99, Unfair Employment Practices, Offsite Lawful Activities, sponsored by Senator Ellis, an act relating to labor and employment. Was referred to committee number 9, which returned to committee recommendation that it do pass. Ayes, Senators Anderson, Beitman, Cooper, Rothfuss, and Wasserberger. Senator Anderson, Chairman.
You've heard the reading of the bill. What's your pleasure, Senator Anderson?
Mr. Chairman, I move that when the committee of the whole rises to report, do so with the recommendation that Senate File 99 do pass. Thank you.
Looks like Senator Ellis will explain.
Senator Ellis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before you, you have Senate File 99, which would amend Wyoming's discriminatory and unfair employment practices section. And so right now, there are a number of things that an employee is protected from. For example, I think we're all familiar that you can't be fired on the basis of your race or gender or things of that nature. But this bill would add another layer of protection. And so this would require, very simply, in the bill is very straightforward on page 2 there. It says for an employer to terminate the employment of an employee because of the employee's engagement or participation in any lawful activity which is conducted during non-working hours and off premises. And it restricts the employer's ability to restrict that employee's ability to participate in any lawful activity during non-working hours. It does provide some caveats. If the employment or the activity relates to a bona fide occupational requirement or is reasonably and rationally related to the employment, then there are some sideboards and protections for the employer. And then there also is a protection in there that says the activity could be prohibited if it's necessary to avoid a conflict or interest or appearance of a conflict. And so this came about, dear senators, I can tell you that this summer I was at a fast food establishment in my town, and there was a local political event happening in front of the Capitol. And as I was ordering my lunch, I was having a conversation with one of the workers, and they were asking me what was going on at the Capitol. And I suggested to the individual, you should check it out when you get off of work. And the employee made a pretty simple comment. He said, I'm worried that if I go to that event, that my boss might fire me. And that comment just really stuck with me. And so in doing a little bit of research and just kind of seeing what was out there, I was familiar with a law that our neighbors to the south has had on the books for a number of years. And so this language that you see before you is very much modeled after some language and laws in other states. There are several states that offer this employment protection, those structured differently depending on the state. But just to give you some assurances about some of the limits of this. Certainly, these paragraphs that you'll see on lines 10 through 18 are limitations. This doesn't give an employee the right to show up to work drunk, even though they maybe had too much to drink the night before, and that's their lawful right to do so. Whatever happens on work sites, if you're impaired and that's against your employment contract, you can still be dismissed. It also draws a distinction between that, bona fide occupational requirements. Certainly there are jobs that require a level of neutrality on political issues. If you work for a nonprofit organization, for example, it also protects employers from appearances of conflicts of interest. So an example would be if you worked for an organization that wanted to make orange the official color of Wyoming, but you were seen off duty supporting an organization that supports the color purple, that would be grounds for termination as well. I think this is a reasonable balance, and how it works right now in looking at what's happened in other states, usually they're lumped in with other discrimination claims. So if an employee feels like they've been discriminated, it usually comes with some kind of claim of race or gender discrimination, as well as this. But there are a few standalone exemptions. One example that I found was, if you have a right to a vacation and you're on vacation and a work matter arises, this doesn't protect your off-duty work activity because it is in your employment contract, depending on what that says, that if you're called in for an emergency, you have to still fulfill that duty for your job. And then there are a few other examples, but most notably, this doesn't protect things like marijuana use, which we've seen in the state to our south, because even though that's recognized as a legal activity under state law, it's not federally. So I think that, there might be some questions about this, but a lot of it will take a case-by-case analysis. But I do think in our society today that we should afford employees, like I mentioned, who are working perhaps in a fast food restaurant, who's not, necessarily associated with that particular brand of fast food chains, that we offer them some level of protection to participate and express themselves politically, or otherwise. This isn't just about politics. This is about any off-duty conduct that's legal. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Any questions on Senate File 99? Senator Hutchings.
Mr. Chairman, this is to the bringer of the bill. This bill bothers me a little bit. When I look at page 2, line 4, I see the word any activity or lawful activity. This gives me cause for pause in that an employer would no longer have the discretion if they saw an employee engaged in any lawful activity that may bring into judgment their, let me see, what's the word I'd like to use? Just maybe their mental capacity, I guess we could say that. So I'd like to know, when we say any, are we saying any? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any further discussion? Senator Landon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just trying to get arms around this one. You know, dating back to some days when I managed some folks, including people like coaches, for example, and I would just remind them that 24 hours a day, they represent the institution that they were working for. So I'm wondering, it was quite lawful, actually, for them to hang out with anyone of age, but I would remind them that we didn't want fraternization with team players, for example, who happened to be of that age. What about going down to establishments and having too many beverages every night? I'm wondering if that comes into play on this bill. I just think there's times, it seems like, in Mr. Chairman, where you have to set some expectations because those employees reflect who they work for, sometimes outside the workplace. So I could use some help with that. Thank you.
Senator Hutchings.
Chairman, it came to mind, good judgment. We've seen over the past 2 summers, a lot of young people engaging in activities that I would consider criminal. And today it seems like better judgment or no judgment at all is being passed, that people can pretty much destroy people's property, go into businesses and steal items without any justice being done. So again, this law brings good judgment into question. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Ellis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Great questions. I want to emphasize that this does not protect unlawful activity. So if you see your employee vandalizing, engaging in any unlawful activity, that is not protected. As to my colleague from Natrona County, I hate to say this because it's such a lawyerly thing to say, but a lot of this is fact dependent in the circumstance. You know, certainly I work for a law firm. We have expectations and a contract we sign, and there's a level of professionalism that's communicated and expected for attorneys in our office. You know, our ability to attract clients. And as I mentioned, if you work in the nonprofit world, expectations that you'll maybe remain neutral or have the appearance of neutrality. If you work in a fundraising capacity, the ability to broadly attract donors might be impaired by some of your off-site activity. So I think some of that is how it's communicated to you when you're hired, and it's the expectation of that's provided for you up front. This does not protect some of those traditional policies that employers often have in place, like non-fraternizing. If you have prohibitions on, you know, for example, attorneys with clients are limited with having certain personal conduct, doctors and patients, that's not protected. Those are all things that are recognized as being general prohibitions. And so there is a distinction, though, between people when you are, you know, as an employee being marketed as part of the team. You know, if you're a partner in law firm, for example, your face is going to be prominently displayed on the website of your firm. Those kind of things really, I think, provide those kind of protections about what the expectation is of how you're going to conduct yourself and how you reflect, your employer. However, on the other end of the spectrum, there are employees who don't have that high profile status. You know, the fast food worker I mentioned, no one likely knows that he or she worked there. They're not marketed by that particular fast food company as being an integral part of the team. So I think that there are some distinct lines that can be drawn that will protect the employer, but it is that just basic level of at-will protection that we're trying to get after. And so I do hate to say that some of that, this is very fact dependent, but that's the fact of the matter is it depends on the employer, it depends on the employee. And I trust that our Department of Workforce Services can start working through and sorting through some of those issues. Just to reiterate this, in looking at research of whether or not this has been abused in other states, I can tell you I haven't done an exhaustive search of cases that have come up in every state, but there are about 14 states that have this law in the books. In our immediate state to the south, there are a handful of cases. But as I mentioned, most of them are mixed with other discrimination employment issues. And so I really don't think that this is going to be wildly abused. And again, the intent is to prevent employers from firing their employees for doing things on their own time that have no connection or don't affect what's happening when they're on the job. And then just a final note, employer protections are strong in this country. You know, you could be fired for using a cell phone that's issued by your employer or even using their Wi-Fi connection. And if you're doing it during work hours, that's prohibited. So again, this is really targeted to off-duty, off work hour activity. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Cost.
If Senator, you want to go first? I will yield to her if she does. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My concern is social media and that things that might appear on there when you're on your off time, that districts, and I mean districts, I should say businesses, have a tendency to frown upon. Is that included in here or is that not included? Because I know there's a definite action that takes place with that sometimes.
Any further discussion? Senator Nethercott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I find this bill pretty dangerous to what is a pro-business state. As an employment lawyer, I can tell you how difficult it is for a business to defend on one of these claims for discrimination. The average timeline on one discrimination complaint, regardless really of how frivolous it might be, 2 to 4 years. 2 to 4 years. It eats up so much time. The Department of Workforce Services comes in on any complaint. They conduct an investigation, demand documents. Then when they are ready, because they receive so many complaints, they issue a final report, which then may go to the Denver field office at that point, to the EEOC, depending on which they determine. And then after the extent of that happens, which is probably another year or 2 years, then the employee gets what's called a right to sue letter. Then they can sue you. And then there's another 3 years of litigation in the court system. So those processes that are intended to be, avoid litigation actually just extended out longer. Now, certainly some of those protections wouldn't apply because what we are doing here is we are creating another protected class that I'm not certain how to identify. Typically, these protections only apply to what we are familiar with from the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which is age, sex, gender, those concepts that we are very much familiar with. And here's this new class for lawful conduct, off work. Well, that is so broad and so hard to get anyone's arms around. To defend against it either from an employee or an employer. Anytime an employer terminated an employee, that employee could say, well, it's because I attended my son's baseball game last night. That my boss doesn't like baseball. She said it once. Boom, triggered. So in an at-will state, it seems harsh that you, as an employer, you have the right to terminate anyone for any reason, so long as it's not in violation of the 1964 Civil Rights Act and is as a basis of discrimination for a protected class. You can do that. And what that results in is actually a pretty efficient workforce, because in business, high employee turnover means you're not having a high functioning business. So you actually don't want to lay people off. But it does allow you to get rid of employees that may not be productive or may be toxic to the environment without having the concern of being sued every time. So I do think that this bill is bad for business. I think it is opens up the door to an extensive amount of broad litigation that will harm businesses for years to come. Question is whether or not their insurance coverage would pay for this type of defense. I really would like to know that.
Senator Kinski.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I don't know, we're creating another cause of action. I don't know how this is ever going to make it to the courthouse, given our shortage of attorneys that we've heard so much about in this legislative session. On and against the bill, for the same reason that I opposed a bill a session or two ago that was going to create litigation for discrimination on the basis of various other sorts of reasons for which people can be aggrieved. We have plenty of reasons to file lawsuits in the state of Wyoming, and I just don't feel like we need more. Especially as to employers. Employers end up being the carrying the burden for enough already. When I was an employer, I just constantly had to deal with the prospect that somebody would be offended somewhere by something, and had to align the workplace to try and address all those possible grievances and still actually take care of people and meet a payroll and hopefully earn a profit. Not only that, the remedies under Wyoming's employment discrimination law are fairly draconian. They go in excess of what I understand the penalties under federal law to be. So federal law, you can be, if your employer is found that they have wrongfully engaged in unfair practice, you can be forced to pay back pay and back benefits. But then it goes beyond that and says, actually, you can be forced to pay what they might have gotten had they stayed on in that position for the rest of their careers. And because the penalties under Wyoming law are potentially so ruinous, as I and my friend from Casper have talked about, you have to lawyer up. You get one of these complaints, whether they have merit or not, you got to lawyer up. So you're looking at it at automatically $5,000 to $10,000, and if you've got to go to the hearing and you've got to defend yourself and call witnesses and do investigations, it can run more. And all it is for the employee is they just file the complaint. And it just is, it's too much. And not every right has a remedy, and not every grievance creates a right. And I see what they're seeking to get at. I can't support one more reason for the employers to get sued and grieved. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Great discussion, of course. But I just want to point out a few things to push on these notions a little bit about creating a new protected class. If you look at 27-9-105, you'll require that, or recall that a few years ago, we had a really good discussion. And it says it here in Romanet 4 under paragraph A, for an employer to require, this is an unlawful practice, to require as a condition of employment that the employee or prospective employee use or refrain from using tobacco products outside the course of employment. We had this discussion. We talked about whether or not we should remove this protection for tobacco users. And I would offer to the body that we do not treat tobacco users on the same level that we treat discrimination claims that are on the basis of race or religion, color, national origin, ancestry, or pregnancy. We don't. And so those are separate protected classes, and I understand the nature of that. The purpose of this amendment is kind of to follow the line of reasoning that we have paragraph 4 in this existing statute. It's what is the extent of your employer's right to tell you what you can do off duty. And so, I knew there'd be concern about this opening the door for massive litigation. I have, as you can imagine, senators, reached out to a number of pro-business organizations that operate in Wyoming to see if they had concerns or if there was any heartburn. And I think if you'd heard that concerns, that would be made well aware to you by this point in the process. In fact, most of them said they were fine with it because a lot of them operate in states that have these kind of protections. And what they don't see are these massive number of cases, expensive litigation that drag on for years. And so I think if you really heard that concern, I would be, happy to work on amendments or even pull the bill. But it's been awfully silent. And I don't know that those claims that this is going to lead to a ton of litigation are founded. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I don't think this is going to produce a ton of litigation. And we have to be mindful of who it's aimed at protecting. I think there are people who are well off to lawyer up that will sue no matter what. But I also think that there are people who are just trying to get by. And we should be doing what we can to make sure their off time, off work premise conduct is protected as long as it's legal. And this is one protection for those kind of individuals from being fired at will for having certain political views or, wanting to go to those baseball games. I don't see that being a problem that we're going to face in Wyoming. And if we do, then this would be ripe for revisiting down the road. But I just don't see that being the case, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Senator Hicks.
Mr. Chairman, on and for the bill, and you're probably wondering, why did Hicks sign on to this bill if it was an attorney employment bill? Given the fact that I still think in our neck of the woods, we may want to consider spraying for him over there in Carbon County. But that being said, Mr. Chairman, I want you to read section 5, page 2 in Romanet 5. This is what gives me great concern. In fact, we've got an example right here in the state of Wyoming. We now have people that employment is jeopardized because they went back to Washington, D.C. here a month and a half ago and participated in a rally. Now, they didn't go up to the Capitol, but just the fact that they were there, there's potential that they're going to lose their job because they went back and exercised their free right to assemble. We've seen an increasing number of cases of government and private sector industry because somebody gets on Facebook and posts support for one political candidate over another, or takes a position supporting a political candidate that the next day they show up to work and they have a termination sheet slip in their inbox. And so now we're at the point that you can't go on and you can't exercise your First Amendment right to free speech. You can't exercise your right to assemble, or you can be terminated for that. This is becoming an increasing frequency, and we've got particular potential right here in the state of Wyoming. Mr. Chairman, it may take a long time in our legal system, but that's what our legal system is designed to do. Mr. Chairman, on and for the bill.
Any further discussion? Senator Nethercott.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I mean, it sounds like what you're hoping to do with those examples, which certainly brings out the fear. And as we've always discussed, it is so dangerous to put broad-based laws in response to one incident. But if what you want to do is make political speech a protected class, then that should be that bill. But that's not what this actually is. This is much broader than participating in political speech. So I just want to make that very clear. This is any lawful activity. This is anything. This is, I can file a complaint for any reason I think I'm terminated. Anytime. I go online to the state's form. It's really great. It's really helpful for employees to ensure that our state is operating in a lawful way. They just fill out the online form. It's about 2 pages. Check the box, sign, boom, call the insurance company. Here we go. That's a fact. So if you want a law to protect speech, go right ahead, but that's not what this bill does. It is far broader and far more destructive to businesses than what you think.
Senator Ellis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. By design, this was intended to be broad. I don't know how to say it more plainly. I mean, maybe somebody doesn't like that I like going to quilting shows on the weekend. I mean, we need to draw some clear lines of what's permissible for an employer to dictate for their employees off-duty, off-premise conduct time when it doesn't reflect on the business. And so this is purposefully broad. It's not just about political speech, and it's not a protected class. It is in the same class that we treat smokers. I would love to hear some argument that somehow by including this paragraph 4 in existing law that we've somehow created a heightened protected class of smokers. We haven't. We are just recognizing some conduct that's prohibited. and it's separate. And so that's the line of this. There's nothing in this that says that court shall afford strict scrutiny and treat these as a protected class or these individuals. So I would just offer this as a common sense approach, I think, to a concern that's out there about our workforce, and also for our employers to set clear expectations when they're hiring people about what their expectations are, how they promote the business, what their activities off duty reflect on. That's all reasonable, and that's all contained, and those exceptions are built in here by purpose and design. So like I said, Mr. Chairman, this isn't new ground. Other states are doing it. I think Wyoming would be best served to afford some base level of protection for at-will employees who want to have their activities protected on their non-working hours. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Question?
Any further discussion? Seeing none. All those in favor of Senator Anderson's motion that when the committee of the whole rise to report, do so with a favorable recommendation on Senate File 99, please say aye. Opposed, say no. I believe that has failed. We'll go ahead and do a standing vote. All those in favor stand? Yeah, everybody just, yep, well, as chairs in doubt, everybody stand if you're in favor. All those in favor of Senate File 99, please stand. Six yes. All those opposed, please stand. Okay, more than six. Pursuant to Senate Rule 6-5, having failed a standing division vote, a roll call vote is required. The chief clerk will call the roll.
Senate File 99, roll call. Anderson? Anderson? Aye. Baldwin? No. Whitman? Excused. Boner? Aye. Bouchard? Aye. Case? No. Cooper? Aye. Driscoll? No. Ellis? Aye. French? No. Purphy? No. Guru? No. Hicks? Aye. Hutchings? No. James? No. Kinsky? No. Cole? No. Cost? No. Landon? No. McEwen? No. Nethercott? No. Pappas? No. Perkins? Excused. Rothfuss? No. Salazar? Aye. Schuler? Aye. Scott? No. Steinmetz? No. Wasserberger? Aye. President Dockstader? No. Whitman? Whitman, aye. Anderson, aye to no. Rothfuss, no to aye. Closing vote. Closing vote closed. Senate File 99, 10 aye, 19 no, 1 excused.
Senate File 99, having failed a roll call vote pursuant to Senate Rule 6-SA, is deemed indefinitely postponed. Next bill for our consideration is Senate File 107. The reading clerk will read in the Senate file.
Senate File 107, Transportation Statutory Amendments 2, an act relating to highways and transportation, sponsored by Senator Landon, was referred to Committee Number 8, which returned a committee recommendation that it do pass. Ayes Senators Anderson, Furphy, Landon, McEwen, Pappas. Senator Landon, Chairman.
Further reading the bill, what is your pleasure, Senator Landon?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would move that when the committee of the whole rise to report, it do so with a due pass recommendation on Senate File 107. Senators, this is one of the, I believe anyway, one of the easiest bills that we'll consider during the session. This is an update to our statutes. A few years ago, we updated these statutes and forgot to bring in alternative fuels, which could include commercial vehicles that operate on natural gas or ethanol, eventually, maybe even a nuclear powered pod. But some of these vehicles are operated differently. and it goes into the statutes. It relates to the IFTA, which is an interstate compact on not having to pay fuel taxes, and it's distributed different ways. But we do allow for temporary permits in some cases. I can drill down into this, Mr. Chairman. Each of those statutory references are alternative fuels, gasoline, diesel. You'll notice in paragraph 2, bottom of the page on page 2, we actually have a statute that still relates to temporary industries that come to our state, and we offer them the privilege of temporary permits. If they're operating on an alternative fuel other than gasoline or diesel, we still expect them to buy that permit. And so that's in essence, the bill. I'd be glad to drill further. Otherwise, I'd call for a question and hope you'll support the bill. Thank you.
Any questions on Senate File 107? Seeing none, all those in favor of Senator Landon's motion that the Committee of the Whole rise and report do so with the favorable recommendation in Senate File 107, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. Senate File 107 is passed Committee of the Whole. The next Senate File for our consideration is Senate File 100? 100. Hearing clerk will read in the Senate File.
Senate File 100, Internet Freedom Prohibiting Discrimination, an act relating to trade and commerce, sponsored by Senator Steinmetz. It was referred to Committee Number 1, which returned a committee recommendation that it do pass. Ayes, Senators Cooper, French, Kolb, and Cost. No, Senator Nethercott. Senator Nethercott, Chairman.
Further reading the bill, what is your pleasure, Senator Nethercott?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that when the Committee of the Whole rises to report, it do so with the do pass recommendation of Senate File 100. And to explain the bill, I call on Senator Steinmetz.
Okay, and there's a standing committee amendment. How would you like to? Oh, never mind. That's not standing. Okay, go ahead. Senator Steinmetz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and that'd be a Committee of the Whole amendment. And if you don't mind, I'll let you know where that applies at the appropriate time during the explanation of the bill. So fellow senators, how many of you this year have been on your phone looking at a message someone sent you and you have an error message 404, this content has been removed? And so unfortunately you weren't able to retrieve that information, and or possibly you're doing a search and something has completely disappeared from the internet and you are unable to find it again. So that is what this bill really is about. It seeks to address the censorship that is happening on some of our platforms in this day. The goal of the bill, which is located in Title 40, Trade and Commerce, creates a new subsection in the Consumer Protection Act to bar radical religious and viewpoint discrimination by large tech companies that function as common carriers or public forums. There is a long history of treating communicative technologies as common carriers, including the telegraph, telephone, radio, and television. So with that, fine senators, I will take you into the bill in Senate File 100. If you look on page 2, you'll see those are the findings. We decided to put that in the bill just so that people knew what we were up to with this bill. You will see on the top of page 3 that the laws of several states and the United States already protect against obscene, violent, or harassing or other dangerous expression. So that will not be contemplated in this bill. Then you will go into the definitions on page 3 and 4. Of particular note is line 2 on page 4, a free speech state. This means any state or territory of the United States or the federal government that protects expression from censorship by interactive computer services based on the viewpoint, race, or religion of a person or a person's expression. You will then see identifiable private information, what that is, the definition of an interactive computer service, and who we are talking about, which means any information service system or access software provider that provides or enables computer access by multiple users to a computer server. Interactive computer service includes networks, websites, and a service or system that provides access to the internet by including systems operated or systems offered by libraries or educational institutions. And then it tells you what is not included. On the bottom of page 4 is where part of the amendment would be inserted. That would be the internet service provider. And that means any entity that provides internet access services and that may also provide associated internet services such as internet transport, encryption, account security services, email hosting services, web hosting services, domain services, data storage services, internet services, and cloud-based solutions. The reason for that addition in our definitions is so that I forgot what they're called, folks that came to the committee meeting that provide our telecommunication services, they wanted assurances that they were not being captured in this bill, and so that is the reason for that inclusion. On to page 5, a few more definitions. On to page 6, that is the prohibition of censorship. There's a prohibition against the ability to share an expression or receive an expression from another person based on the race, religion, or viewpoint of the user or other person. And then there's also a geographic prohibition at the bottom of 6 and on to page 7. The applicability, this only applies on line 8 going down on page 7 to an entity that functionally has more than 20 million active users within a 30-day period, or of 150 million active users within a one calendar month. So, and it is only to protect a user residing in or doing business, sharing expression, receiving expression in this state, in any other free speech state, which is on page 8, or on D, any other state or territory of the United States. And it shall also not be construed at the bottom of page 8 and top of page 9 to authorize or censor under the laws of Wyoming or the United States to prohibit an interactive computer service from censoring unlawful expression. So that is still applicable there, and it does not apply to the computer service that has only been available to users for not more than 12 months or is engaged in its own expression. So then you will see the remedies section. What that basically covers is this section provides for declaratory, injunctive, and monetary relief, including costs and reasonable attorney fees to any prevailing user. It also provides for actions against persons to aid and abet any discrimination under the statute. The section also secures a jury trial in such actions and authorizes courts to hold defendants in contempt if they fail to comply with any order. The section also provides for damages and action when an interactive computer service discloses identifiable private information on the grounds that it is a breach of a fiduciary duty. So basically then, in the rest of the bill to page 18, it just applies the same thing to the social media platforms. It is, it's just the same language applied to a different medium. And then the rest of the amendment applies on page 18 under the severability. We're just making it more severable in case it would be challenged in court. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I've described the bill probably too much, and I would be glad for any questions.
Any questions on the bill before we get to the committee of the whole amendment? Senator Hutchings and Senator Kinsey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just really quickly, I heard the word several times of free speech state. And I know in our Wyoming Constitution, we have in Article 1, Section 20, freedom of speech. And it mentions every person may freely speak, write, and publish on all subjects, being responsible for the abuse or right of that. Is this what you're talking about? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Kinsey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good little bill. I apologize if you covered this in your overview of the bill, but how does this stack up against the, let me see, it's Federal Communications Act of 1996, Section 230, which provides, well, it's one that's been much in the news. It provides immunity from civil liability for operators of internet sites for removal or moderation of third-party material they deem obscene or offensive, even if constitutionally protected speech, as long as done in good faith. That's a federal statute and I wonder how that stacks up against a state statute like this. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Stebbins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, obviously it is intended to protect the freedom of speech, and so thank you for that good question. Secondly, this bill would not violate Section 230 of the Federal Communications Act. It is widely assumed that Section 230 enables big tech companies to restrict material without legal accountability, thus precluding state remedies. In fact, Section 230 does not protect the companies from the suits or injunctive or declaratory relief and provides them with no protection at all for viewpoint discrimination. And there is an argument that you can see the Constitution can crack Section 230. It also avoids any collision with Section 230 by focusing on racial, religious, and viewpoint discrimination, since Section 230 does not protect companies and such discrimination. It does not bar this bill. So that is the information I have on Section 230. There are also a couple of Supreme Court cases, Red Lion Broadcasting versus FCC 395 US 367, in which the Supreme Court said there is no sanctity in the First Amendment for unlimited private censorship operating in a medium not open to all. And also the court in Red Lion quoted its earlier decision in the Associated Press versus the United States 326 US 120 in 1945. Freedom of the press from governmental interference under the First Amendment does not sanction repression of that freedom by private interests. So I hope that answers those questions. And if there's no further questions, I'd move the, ask that the amendment be read in and move the amendment.
It looks like there is a question right now. Actually, Senator Perkins.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I did have one question for the sponsors of the bill. We're looking at working with this issue of private information, and there's so you're defining identifiable private information on page 4, lines 8. So identify private information there just means private information that may be reasonably expected to be associated with the user and could be reasonably be associated with the user. So basically it's, information that somebody could, and then you have, and then on the following page on line 1, you also define further private information. Just means information acquired by an interactive computer service or social media platform from an internet user has not expressly given prior authentication for the release or disclosure of the information, including specific content, form, or recipient of the information. So as I go about that, so first of all, my first question would be, a lot of times when you get on one of these platforms or when you do any of these things, one of the first things happens is if you're going to use it, you have to use their user service agreement, which no one reads, but in the fine print usually says, by using this or agreeing to this, you've expressly given permission to use that information. And so, anyway, as I looked at, and then the other reason I bring that up is because particularly you go to page 11 of the bill and you get to subsection F, where you have any loss, release, or distribution by an interactive computer service of identifiable private information that has been collected by the interactive computer shall be deemed a breach of a fiduciary duty and shall be subject to any remedy or recovery authorized by law. And then if they intentionally or recklessly lose or release the distribution, then they can, they have the ability to recover whatever damages they've got in treble damages, or $1 million, whichever one you pick. And so I'm just trying to figure all this stuff out, because in most platforms, first of all, people are already disseminating tons of private information. In fact, most people disseminate too much private information. Again, you're going to have in the user agreement, you're most likely going to give an express consent to use that information. And then down here, you're going to charge them for the release. And believe me, I don't have any sympathy for these platforms and these social media. I don't have but I'm just wondering how that all works because to me, it sounds good, but I don't know how that works in reality. And it may be a great remedy, but I don't know how in reality it works, that it's going to find a way to be enforceable. I just wondered if you had any information about that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any further questions? Senator Stevens.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'll probably have to get back to you on that, how that would work. However, this bill contemplates them being regulated like a common carrier. So that's the premise of it. So if there are no further questions, I would move. Did we read in the
No,
amendment?
we'll need to read it in the.
Could we
committee of the
read
whole
that
amendment.
in?
Senate File 100, Committee of the Whole Amendment Number 1, corrected copy, page 4 after line 21, insert.
Senator Stevens.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I would move Committee of the Whole Amendment Number 1 to Senate File 100 and ask for your favorable consideration. I explained that during the explanation of the bill, so I'd call for the question if there's no further questions on the amendment.
Any questions on the Committee of the Whole Amendment? Okay, all those in favor of Senator Stevens' motion that one to adopt Committee of the Whole Amendment Number 1, Senate File 100, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say no. Motion carries. You're back on the bill.
Question?
Okay. Seeing no further discussion, all those in favor of Senator Nethercott's motion that when the Committee of the Whole rise to report and do so with a favorable recommendation on Senate File 100, say aye. Opposed, say no. Motion carries. Senate File 100 has passed Committee of the Whole. The next Senate file for our consideration is Senate File 38. Hearing clerk will read the Senate file.
Senate File 38, Decentralized Autonomous Organizations, an act relating to corporations sponsored by the Blockchain Task Force, was referred to Committee Number 7, which returned to committee recommendation that it do pass amended. Ayes, Senators Boner, Case, Driscoll, Nethercott, and Scott. Senator Driscoll, Chairman.
Okay, somebody from corporations. Senator Driscoll.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the Committee of Whole rise to report to do so with a favorable recommendation on Senate File 100.
38.
38, I'm sorry. And what's the bill? I call on Senator Nethercott. I was just walking out of the.
Senator Nethercott.
Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good senators, you have in front of you Senate File 38, Decentralized Autonomous Organizations, commonly referred to as a DAO. And this is a fun new construct that comes to you from the Select Committee on Blockchain, Financial Technology, and Digital Innovation. So this will be one of those first concepts in the world that came to the Blockchain Committee. And we spent a significant amount of time struggling, listening to feedback, listening to stakeholders and constituents, really understanding what type of corporate form they were seeking and that could be utilized. So what this bill does is it creates a supplement or kind of dovetails underneath our LLC laws, does not change our LLC laws. Very clear to understand that there is no change to our current LLC laws. This is a new statutory section that, again, dovetails into it. And it allows for ownership of a company through a blockchain and through a decentralized autonomous organization, thus the name DAO, allows for the use of digital assets, as we've already defined in our laws, and provides that limited liability status, of course. Talks about the ownership of the company and how that can be done in a distributed and decentralized way, consistent with how a blockchain operates, how the voting of the corporation works, what a quorum is, and how really the business communicates amongst its members, primarily through what is a smart contract, which we've also identified in statute. Good senators, this is a fascinating bill and a fascinating concept that we hope will drive the economy of Wyoming forward. It really adopts many of our corporate structures and corporate protections and applies them to this new type of business ownership. There's no fiscal impact. I would stand for questions. Is there a standing committee amendment? There is. If I can have that read in.
Senate File 38, Standing Committee Amendment Number 1, page 3, line 12, after.
Senator Nethercott.
Mr. Chairman, I would move Standing Committee Amendment Number 1 to Senate File 38 and ask for your favorable consideration. Good senators, this is just cleanup language to the bill, providing further clarification to what a definition of an agreement is and a membership interest. So with that, I stand for questions on the amendment.
Any discussion on the standing committee amendment? Seeing none, all those in favor of Senator Endicott's motion to adopt standing committee amendment number 1, the Senate File 38, say aye. Opposed, say no. We're back on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ask for your aye vote on this amazing bill for Wyoming's business future.
Any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor of Senator Driscoll's motion that when the committee of the whole rise to report, do so with a favorable recommendation on Senate File 38, say aye. Opposed, say no. Senate File 38 is passed committee of the whole. The next Senate File for our consideration is Senate File 39.
Senate File 39, Digital Identity, an act relating to trade and commerce sponsored by the Blockchain Task Force, was referred to committee number 9, which returned a committee recommendation that it do pass amended. I, Senators Anderson, Beitman, Cooper, Rothfuss, and Wasserberger. Senator Anderson, Chairman.
Okay, you've heard the reading of the bill. What is your pleasure, Senator Rothfuss?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that when the committee of the whole rises to report, it do so with a due pass recommendation on Senate File 39 and will defer to myself for consideration. Mr. Chairman, Senate File 39, Digital Identity, is another puzzle piece from the Blockchain Select Committee in the off season. It's a short bill, but I'm going to say hundreds of human hours probably went into it. We had a working group that was assembled of experts in the digital identity space that came together to try and draft what is the first of its kind legislation once again in the country. And it's a foundational piece of legislation contemplating a definition of digital identity, which we'll get to in a second, talk a little bit more about what that is. The idea here is to establish a foundation that we'll build off of during the next interim. The concept of a digital identity even harkens back to the previous piece of legislation we just discussed with decentralized autonomous organizations, where we're trying to make sure that individuals as persons or organizations, whether that's a corporation, government, or whatever else, are capable of effectively and legally engaging in smart contracts, in appropriate recognition of privacy rights, and really making sure that we've got legal standing for digital identity. So this simple bill, despite all of the work that's gone into it, has a couple of key provisions. The first you see on page 2, we add some definitions back into a new act called Digital Identity Act. We add new definitions, but it refers back to existing Title 8, and I'll get to those definitions that you see. Actually, I'll go to them first. They're on page 4, and then I'll skip back in the bill because this is the key meat of the legislation. It's simply a definition of personal digital identity, which means the intangible digital representation of, by, and for a natural person over which he has dominion. That dominion word is going to be the subject of the amendment. We'll get right back to it. And through which he intentionally communicates or acts. And then there's parallel language for an organizational digital identity, where we just describe what an organization is. That can be a corporation, business trust, estate, etc. And it has that same definition of over which it has dominion and through which it intentionally communicates or acts. And at this time, I would ask that the standing committee amendment be read in, because I'm going to work that right now.
Senate File 39, Standing Committee Amendment number 1, page 4, line 3, delete.
Senator Roberts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move Standing Committee Amendment number 1 to Senate File 39, ask the body's favorable consideration. There was a little bit of discomfort with the word dominion. Sovereignty was what we wanted to use at first. Sovereignty caused all sorts of problems because sovereignty has meaning with regard to actual government structure. There's too much connotation there. So with further consideration, after we first prepared the bill, we came up with the idea of principal authority instead of dominion, and that seems to work an awful lot better. This team of attorneys and technologists all concurred that this was a superior word choice. I like it a lot better also. So we have on line 3, it would read, over which he has principal authority and through which he intentionally communicates or acts, and then that's replaced in parallel. Let's take action quickly on the standing committee amendment. If there are any questions on the standing committee amendment, I'd answer them. Otherwise, I'd call for the questions on the standing committee amendment.
Any discussion on the standing committee amendment? Seeing none, all those in favor of Senator Office's motion to adopt standing committee amendment number 1 in Senate File 39, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say no. Motion carries. We're back on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we've got these definitions then, and those definitions are somewhat empowered, just indicating that the individual is capable of acting through this digital construct and that the organization is capable of acting through the digital construct. And then back on page 2, the only empowerment that this legislation really provides is that these definitions are recognized through UEDA, which is our Uniform Electronic Transactions Act. And basically it's parallel language with what we have in UEDA, saying that somebody, an individual, can act through their personal digital identity and that those actions are attributable to that natural person, or that the organizations can act through their digital identity and that those actions are attributable, and that the effects shall be taken based on the circumstances and context of those actions. So, Mr. Chairman, right now, this is a framework for further work. It's relatively straightforward and simple and almost intuitive. You would expect that you would have all of these legal authorities and you would expect that all of this was true. But this actually hasn't been laid down in any other state as a fundamental premise that is then built upon. And the future of where this legislation is intending to go, when we work on it during the next interim, is to build on it things like privacy rights, as we discussed a little while ago, property rights, which are obviously essential for ownership and transactions in a digital asset space, and for other operations within this world that we're moving into and that we're trying to build through the blockchain legislation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With that, I'd call for the question bill. If there's I'd call for questions on the bill, and if there are no questions, I'd call for the question. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, Senator Perkins.
Thank you. Just so as I understand this, first of all, this is obviously it has to do with blockchain, and you're going to establish the digital identities. It's going to be part of the blockchain so that a person may or may not be able to be known, but you're going to be certain that it's whoever owns that blockchain, that's the person, and whoever did it, it's going to be attributable to them because the blockchain is so secure that no one else could have done it. And so I get that. And so, I mean, as I'm looking at this is really kind of a logical step when you get there. We already have, Wyoming has had in force for a considerable period of time, the Electronic Signature Act, which says basically if you send a text or you send an email or anything that like that has any kind of indication that that's you and that's your signature, it's considered to be binding as though you signed it. So we're getting past this. So this is just, as I understand, this is just getting ready for the next stage of that digital identity, that digital transaction area. And I'm seeing nodding the head. So that's the first question. And then the second question will be, of course, the other thing will be is I think we all want to establish and be sure that we have secure privacy rights, and certainly blockchain is has that in dramatic and extended fashion. The other side of that coin is that there are certain times when identity becomes and those privacy rights go too far, and it becomes absolutely essential that you identify certain individuals. And so, and that was, if we go back to the initial blockchain and some of the concerns that the Homeland Security and the FBI and others had, the SEC had about these things. And this, I know this is evolving. So my question to you is with that background is simply, as we develop this, will we keep an eye about striking that balance so that this doesn't become a haven for illegal and untraceable transactions, so that when something is really wrong, and when something could be physically wrong, could be stealing property, could be money laundering, could be any of those things, that somehow, some way there's protection so we can find those who are abusing the use of blockchain, and we can actually figure out who they are and bring them to justice. I know that's way beyond the scope of this bill, but just as we move in that direction, I think that's just, it's going to be really important we find and find that balance. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Nethercott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It sounds like there's concern from the body about criminal activity using electronic devices. I share the concern. And I have tried to allow for the authorization for electronic warrants associated with investigating those types of crimes. Fortunately, excuse me, I digress. Fortunately, however, without those warrants, how law enforcement finds that information, I think is a good question, because they actually can't go, access a lot of that information without getting that hard drive or other pieces. Theoretically, you can't do anything online or on a computer without leaving a trace through code, through leaving a digital footprint in some way or some fashion. And certainly that's a challenge of the brightest and best hackers of the world. But a cat and mouse game, as all criminal activity is, hoping we have the right tools to stay the cat and not the mouse. But that's it. It always can be traced, even using a digital identity, through different types of SHA values and different type of code. So, the challenge is there if we give the tools to the right people.
Senator Hutchins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Tried to be fast. Maybe this is a piggyback on the senator from Natrona's question. How can you be sure Sally is Sally and not Jimmy? We've seen that before, where someone claims to be something or someone, and with the tracing, you're able to find out that they're not nefarious players. So for me, how do you get that assurance? And using your words, I want to see it played out. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Culp.
Thank you, Chairman. Just a question to the more learned. I hear this train is being constructed. The pieces are coming together, but it's not quite ready. We're not there yet, but we're going to get there. Well, I guess the question would really be, is this thing going to go live? When? Are these just building blocks for further discussion, so there's nothing really live yet? And that general questions of that nature. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Office.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the discussion. Following up on the good Senator from Natrona County's question about balancing interests here and balancing rights. I think as long as the good senator who's the chair of the Judiciary Committee is on that committee, and I'm also on that committee, I think balance is going to be inherent in the outcome as we struggle through the privacy issues from each side. There is a lot to be considered and looked at from property rights and from privacy rights when it comes to digital identities. And trying to sort those concepts out, what is recognized as a property right and what is recognized as a privacy right interest. And again, that's, I think, the core of the work ahead. But as we look to the technology, I agree with the good senator that tools will remain in place, that there's nothing unique about this that either precludes or includes necessarily additional protections. It really comes down to how it's implemented, what you have surrounding it statutorily that's going to provide those protections. Getting at the question from the good senator from here in Laramie County about how can you be sure that somebody is who they say they are, that is at the heart, good senator, of why this digital identity concept is moving forward. That's honestly the identification of the purpose. That's why we're in it. And we have those challenges right now, and it is very difficult. A great little application that we talk a lot about, a use case of a simple digital identity concept, is an alternative to what we have right now, where you've got your identification, you carry it with you probably, and if you're going in to a bar or liquor store and you're buying a 6-pack of beer, they'll ask you for your ID, and you take out your ID and you show them your ID. The only question they really have is the question, are you 21? But they look at your ID and they know not only are you 21, so they answered that yes, no question, but they know your name, they know your address, they know whether you're an organ donor. They know a lot about you. And you don't necessarily want them to know that, but we don't have a very sophisticated identification system. But that was the nature of that question is, are you somebody who's 21? We have these types of queries all the time. So a digital identity concept is trying to build a framework, and there are many already commercially out there that are available. This legislation is entirely technology neutral by intent. But if you wanted to obtain a digital identity, I can chat with you afterwards and you can get yourself a nice little authoritative digital identity. And then when you go, instead of it saying your name and address, there are systems in place that will allow you to authenticate various pieces of information without necessarily having to provide all the details that you don't want to provide. HIPAA is another great example. Maybe you want to provide a portion of your health information, but maybe you don't want to provide a lot of other information depending on whom you're talking to. This gets at the heart of the digital identity question. As to how you can be sure, most of these systems, and again, it's not in the statute, but I think you're looking for kind of the broader picture here. Most of these systems require a preliminary trusted authenticator. We talk a lot about banks as being one of those institutions. Why? Because when you get your bank account right now, federal law, through the Bank Secrecy Act and through Know Your Customer Anti-Money Laundering Acts, require an awful lot of proof that you are who you say you are, right? To open that first bank account, they need to know who you are, and they even need to maintain knowledge of who you are. So under a digital identity system, what they imagine is something along the lines of, all right, well, if a bank is an authenticator because they've done all of this due diligence and they say you are who you say you are, we'll count that as authoritative. And then you will have some type of key or your personal phone or something else which demonstrates that you are that identity, and that provides the authentication. And typically you'll do that through a secret key, password kinds of concepts, and that might be coupled with two-factor authentication using hardware of your phone or something along those lines. So there are a lot of systems out there, and at that point, you could authoritatively prove that you and only you are who you say you are. With organizations, this is something that is a real desired application, which is for a state to authoritatively confirm that a corporation is who it says it is. And there's something called a public key secret key pair, which is used for that. That's common. That's actually how we do things. We don't know we're doing it, but we're doing it when we're banking. We're doing it a lot of the time where we're using public key secret key pairs. We're exchanging them, and using that, we can communicate. But it can also be used for authentication, where if I have a secret key, I generate from that secret key what's called a public key. And if the state of Wyoming were saying Chris Rothfuss Corporation authoritatively on our website, and then has my public key authoritatively listed there, that would be unique and first of its kind for a state, but it would be fully empowering because anybody could interact and encrypt messages or encrypt transactions or prove transactions with that corporation using that secret key authoritatively so that only that corporation could act, and you would know that the transaction was with that corporation provably. Great mathematics. I probably shouldn't go into it any longer now. Everyone's going to glaze over, but I know the good senator's interested, and I'll follow up with her later on that detail. And the final question is, good senator from the southwestern part of the state, you know, are we going to get there eventually, or are we just talking about putting this together? We've been working on this, Mr. Chairman, for 4 or 5 years now. We have, I can't even count the number of states that have either domiciled or, the number of corporations that have either domiciled in Wyoming or re-domiciled in Wyoming as a result of these pieces of legislation. I sent around a newspaper article. It's not a real newspaper article, it's an online article. I'd encourage you to read from a few days ago about one of the companies that we've been engaged with over recent years that is the first Speedy Bank, which is a product of this. And it's just all one of the puzzle pieces, but the one they're using. And this company is the first Speedy Bank, and it's been interacting with Wyoming, and they're looking at a potential valuation between $10 and $20 billion as they move to a public announcement. So we have the pieces, but we're looking for more pieces. Other states have copied what we've done so far. The key is to be the first mover and put together this comprehensive picture. There are a lot more pieces that need to go into it. And again, that's probably for later discussion or offline and not relevant to this bill. And I'd be happy to sit down and chat with you about all of these things because I'm fascinated by them. I know my colleagues are as well. But there are a lot of pieces in place. There's still a lot more pieces. It's not a one bill solution, I'm afraid, and we'll keep working. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'll defer to my colleague who I see
Senator
standing up,
Nethercutt.
probably just to cut me off.
You're welcome. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senators, I think it's important to recognize that so much of what we do on the blockchain is pretty visionary and pretty cutting edge. This is part of that. But in reality, here's an article from 2018 from a major publisher starts with F, one word. Ends with ORBES. From 2018, digital identity is not a thing of the future. Its implementation and impact are already becoming widespread. It's important for all companies and organizations to know exactly what it is and put better means of managing the data they hold into effect soon before it's too late. It's not only about preventing fraud, it's also about asserting who we are in this society. Everything we do is online, so it's necessary to adapt how we adapt and how we enable people to claim who they are. So who are the other major entities in the world doing this right now, and particularly in the United States? They exist. In our country has the Trusted Identities Group that is working on this through the National Institute of Standards and Technology, constantly also revising digital identity guidelines. So building up and standing up the technology associated with how we interface with the world around us, primarily in an online and digital world, although not newspaper publications. But we're getting there through digital identity.
Senator Perkins.
Thank you. Just want to follow on. So as I listen to this, Mr. Chairman, it occurs to me that this is actually kind of a two-edged sword, that ultimately at the end of this road, as we talk about this, it's not only just going to, it's going to protect privacy rights, but the other side of it's almost like electronic DNA. And the other side is if it's electronic DNA and it comes back and you're using this for the wrong purposes, it's also going to be available to trace that series of events or those series of transactions back to a specific person. And it's going to be very, very difficult to hide from that. I think that's also the other side of this. And if you'd confirm that, I'd just appreciate it. But I think it's a sword that's going to cut both ways for both privacy and also identify those that you're just going to be hard to run away from as well. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Office.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As to the last question, it really depends on what system you're using and how you're engaging. So the answer is a definite maybe. It doesn't have to, and you don't necessarily have to engage. There's nothing that compels you in this legislation. If you do and you're leaving footprints because you're engaging heavily, those footprints will be seen. If you don't engage in a way that would leave footprints, then you don't necessarily have to leave them, but obviously that would be a lesser use case, which is very much like right now when you're using the internet. There's a lot of footprints that you'll leave behind if you're leaving behind footprints, but if you're not engaging in a way that does, you won't. And I wouldn't expect any difference there. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any further discussion on Senate File 39? Seeing none, all those in favor of Senator, who was it? Senator Office's motion that when the committee of the whole rise to report and do so with favorable recommendation on Senate File 39, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say no. Senate File 39 is passed committee of the whole. The next Senate file for our consideration is Senate File 75. The reading clerk will read in the file.
Senate File 75, Protective Orders Amendments, an act relating to the courts sponsored by Senator Landon. It was referred to committee number 1, which returned to committee recommendation that it do pass amended. Ayes, Senators Cooper, French, Cole, Cost, and Nethercott. Senator Nethercott, Chairman.
You've heard the reading of the bill. What is your pleasure, Senator Nethercott?
Mr. Chairman, I move that when the committee of the whole rises to report, it do so with the due pass recommendation of Senate File 75. To explain this good little bill, I call on Senator Landon.
Senator Landon.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would point out that there is a standing committee amendment, but we'll get to that in a little bit. I want to walk you into Senate File 75. You know, Mr. Chairman, I love the way this citizen legislative experience works. Not long ago, back in my community, somebody from the legal profession, I was having a visit with them, and they indicated that there had been a case involving an area of interest of mine that took place over in the Sweetwater country. And they pointed to the fact that that case was actually decided in kind of a different way than what most of us, I think, would expect. Mr. Chairman, a handful of years ago, I began to work with a coalition up in my neighborhood who has worked so diligently and carefully on domestic violence and stalking orders and stalking laws. And you might remember we brought some legislation and I worked with the Judiciary Committee. That bill that I brought just simply wasn't ready. We worked it, and went into an interim, and the Judiciary Committee ended up doing some outstanding work to really work on our stalking laws. Well, knowing that I had that interest, this individual indicated and told me about this case. And so that's the genesis of Senate File 75. After educating myself, and I'm still educating myself on this, Mr. Chairman, I learned that these protection orders, and specifically stalking and sexual assault and domestic violence protective orders, must be viewed and treated like all valid orders of the court. So Senate File 75 would do two things. It allows the parties to protection orders to make knowing and voluntary stipulations to the order and allow the court to have jurisdiction. This saves time for the court, Mr. Chairman. It allows the victims to not have to face their stalker or their abuser at the height of this crisis that they find themselves in. It allows respondents to not have this impact to impact any other criminal charges that may exist at the time of this stipulation. And in cases like this, Mr. Chairman, often there may not be an attorney present, for example, but it also allows the respondents to not have to, it ensures that the order is valid and enforceable, just like any other stipulated order in a civil or criminal court. On page 1 of this bill, 73509 relates to stalking and sexual assault protection orders. Specifically, we've added the clarifying language there. That language continues over on page 2, where it is followed by 3521-105, which relates to the domestic violence protective orders. We've added the identical clarifying language there. And that language is this, Mr. Chairman: a respondent may make a knowing and voluntary stipulation that a court may exercise jurisdiction over the respondent and issue an order pursuant to this section without a hearing, factual finding, or admission that the conduct giving rise to the petition occurred. Mr. Chairman, some Wyoming attorneys who work with protection orders every day and to ensure protective orders aren't treated differently than any other court order suggested that we needed one more sentence. And that is the committee amendment that was discussed by the standing committee. And Mr. Chairman, I will come back with a couple of other comments on Senate File 75. But in the meantime, I would ask that you call on the good chairman who can speak to the standing committee amendment.
Okay, we need to get that standing committee amendment read in.
Senate File 75, Standing Committee Amendment number 1, page 2, line 3, after.
Senator Nethercott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move Standing Committee Amendment number 1 to Senate File 75 and ask for your favorable consideration. Good senators, the sponsor of this legislation and the senator from Natrona County actually explained this amendment primarily through its purpose, which is to really provide further clarifications to the court that they can indeed, which they always have, enter into stipulations for these types of agreements But what's really important here is it further reinforces what the bill is trying to do. And so it says an order entered pursuant to this section without a hearing, factual finding or admission that the conduct giving rise to the petition occurred shall be valid and enforceable and have the same force and effect as a protective order entered with findings of fact and conclusions of law. And so that means it has the same effect as if it went through a full hearing, as if it had a stipulation. So with that, I'd ask for your stand for questions and ask for your favorable consideration.
Any discussion on the standing committee amendment? Seeing none, all those in favor of Senator Nethercott's motion to adopt standing committee amendment number 1 in Senate File 75, say aye. Opposed, say no. Motion carries. We're back on the bill. Any further discussion? Senator Landon.
Mr. Chairman, just to bring it home on this bill, we had some courts that were operating a little bit differently. I think this spells out in our statutes that we do expect and allow for these protection orders to be stipulated to. It does it across the board in 2 different statutes. I want to recognize the good chairman of our Judiciary Committee. When I heard about this and began to work on Senate File 75, I reached out to the good senator right away because I don't go anywhere without my attorney, and really appreciate the help that was given. I think this is a good bill, senators. It clarifies for our courts what we expect to go on, and we can always talk more and more detail about domestic violence, the stalking stuff, but this is going to help, Mr. Chairman. So I hope you'll support Senate File 75.
Any discussion on Senate File 75? Seeing none, all those in favor of Senator Nethercott's motion that when the committee of the whole rise to report, do so with a favorable recommendation of Senate File 75, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say no. Senate File 75 is passed committee of the whole. The next Senate file for our consideration is Senate File 58. The reading clerk will read the file.
Senate File 58, Wyoming Investment in Nursing Funding, sponsored by the Education Committee, an act relating to administration of the government. It was referred to committee number 2, beg your pardon, first referral was to committee number 4, which returned to committee recommendation that it do pass amended. Ayes, Senators Beitman, Ellis, Rothfuss, Salazar, and Scott. Senator Scott, chairman, was re-referred to committee number 2, which returned to committee recommendation that it do pass. Ayes, Senators Kinsky, Perkins, and Steinmetz. Excused, Senators Guru and Hicks. Senator Kinsky, acting chairman.
You've heard the reading of the bill. What is your pleasure, Senator Scott?
Mr. Chairman, I move in the committee of the whole rise and report it do so with the recommendation that Senate File 58 do pass. There was a standing committee amendment I asked it read in at this time.
Senate File 58, Standing Committee Amendment number 1, page 1, line 3 after.
Senator Scott.
Mr. Chairman, I move adoption of the standing committee amendment. Mr. Chairman, let me explain the amendment and the process. I'll partly explain the bill. It's a joint interim education bill, so I was not involved in the development of the bill, but I'm familiar with the program because the program came through Committee 10 a number of years ago. It's a loan program trying to encourage students to go into nursing because we're short of nurses. Has 2 components to it. One, trying to develop more nursing faculty, which are in short supply, and the other trying to just develop more nurses. It has been significantly cut back due to our budget situation. The bill appears to have been developed by the Joint Interim Education Committee to seek CARES Act funding at a special session that didn't happen because a number of the committees did this. We were anticipating there would be another special session, and the powers that be decided that we didn't really need one. So this is one of those. The Education Committee carried the bill forward as an interim bill to this session, but it was designed for the purpose of a special section for the CARES Act. What we've done, Mr. Chairman, and this is the amendment or most of it, is broaden the thing, got rid of the language that related specifically to the CARES Act as it was initially came to us that was going to expire designed it so it could take leftover CARES Act money, which it turns out we do have because the feds changed the rules after the December deadline. And then we broadened it so if there's more stimulus money that appears, that will be available. The idea is if we get enough, it'll bring us up to what the program was originally funded for before we had to cut the budgets, because it is an important program, because we need the nurses and we need the faculty members trained. So what the standing committee amendment does, most of it is clean up language, making the bill broader, making the bill available to spend additional stimulus money if we get it. We did add a sunset date. You'll see at the bottom of the page, first page in the standing committee amendment, so that it goes away July 1st, 2022. So at the end of the biennium, it'll go away. I think that's appropriate. I hate these things when something that was designed for one purpose hangs around, and then somebody tries to use it for something it wasn't intended to. That's the point of that. Mr. Chairman, that's a very quick summary of the standing committee amendment. I'd be happy to answer any question. I urge its adoption.
Any discussion on the standing committee amendment? Seeing none, all those in favor of Senator Scott's motion to adopt standing committee amendment number 1, the Senate File 58, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say no. Motion carries. We're back on the bill.
Mr. Chairman, I've sort of described the bill with the CARES Act funding that's left over. I'm told as of the desired appropriation of $264,000, that we might get 20 of that. That's not very much, but when you're doing these loans and whatnot, that will help. I understand there's a much bigger stimulus that I'm unclear whether it has passed or is about to pass at this point. We don't know exactly what's in it yet and what the regulations will be, which may be key, but I think this may well have a much larger effect as a result of that stimulus. It'll bring a program we very much need up to a level that the state can really use, that we had planned. But every little bit helps, Mr. Chairman. So with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions in the bill. I urge its adoption.
Any discussion? Senator Salazar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A terribly important bill. It's going to help, especially with our shortage of nurses. And I want to thank the Chairman of Education on this. Thank you.
Any further discussion? Senator Hutchings.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just a little concerned here. I keep hearing there's a shortage of nurses, and just about every young person in my church, and we have a lot of them, are in the nursing program. And I just want to get this straight. We want to pass a bill before we really know whether we have the COVID funds. And if we don't get these funds, what are we going to do with this program? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any further discussion? Senator Scott.
Mr. Chairman, if we don't get these funds, the federal funds, it sounds like we will get a little. But if we don't get them, then we don't educate as many nurses as we'd like to. We'd like to educate all the ones that potentially could qualify for this, which does relate, I think, to the availability within the state of those programs. We'd like to do that, but we can't afford it, which is why we're trying to use the federal money when that came along. It is something that we need, but something we can't afford to do with general fund as much as we'd like to. This does not appropriate any additional general funds.
Senator Hutchings.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick follow-up. And I don't mean to sound insensitive, but we have need for lawyers, for instance. I'm just wondering, where will the state stop at trying to help and subsidize everyone's education? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Scott.
Mr. Chairman, I feel like I'm back uh, depending what Committee Ken did. We have used these loan forgiveness programs to meet healthcare provider shortages on quite a scale. And we have these shortages. A number of our neighboring states have these shortages, and we're in competition. And in this case, it's not just subsidizing people's education because education is a good thing to subsidize, which it is. It is also trying to meet very real needs we have to provide health care for our citizens. And we are short. We're doing it with doctors. We're doing it with dentists. We're doing it with, I think, veterinarians. We're doing it with a number of these professions. Nurses are a key component of healthcare, and we're trying to get more because we haven't got as many as we need, and that's hurting our ability to deserve the kind of healthcare that our citizens want and deserve. And so this has been an effective way to do it. And we're just trying to use some of the crumbs we get from the federal government to carry out the program that we would be able to fully fund if the federal government wasn't so hostile to our economy.
Any further discussion on the Senate file? Seeing none, all those in favor of Senator Scott's motion that when the committee of the whole rise and report do so with a favorable recommendation on Senate file 58, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say no. Senate file 58 is passed committee of the whole. The next Senate file for our consideration is Senate file 66.
Senate File 66, Slayer Rule applied to joint ownership, sponsored by Senator Cooper, an act relating to wills, descendants estates, and probate code. It was referred to Committee Number 1, which returned to committee recommendation that it do pass amended. Ayes Senators Cooper, French, Kolb, Cost, and Nethercott. Senator Nethercott, Chairman.
Senator Nethercott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that when the committee of the whole rises to report, it do so with the do pass recommendation on Senate File 66. There is a standing committee amendment, if I can have that read in.
Senate File 66, Standing Committee Amendment Number 1, page 2, line 10, delete.
And to explain this bill, I would call on Senator Cooper.
Senator Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Madam Chair. Before we go into the why, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the what. As this title says, this is Slayer's Rule applied to joint tenancy. Slayer's Rule is some old English medieval rule that says if you kill somebody, you can't inherit, or you can't profit from their death. Okay, within the statutes of the state of Wyoming, 2-14-101, taking of a life precludes one from inheritance, insurance, survivorship benefits, how the benefits are distributed, and that's pretty straightforward. But what it doesn't address is joint tenancy with right of survivorship, tenancy by entirety, or any other form of co-ownership with rights of survivorship. So what we're wanting to do here is apply that old Slayer's Rule to modern law, which is joint tenancy with the right of survivorship. With that said, I'll give you a little background. We heard testimony a couple days ago from a gentleman, a father. Got notification that his daughter had been murdered by her husband. Not just murdered, she was executed. He came home, whatever the circumstance of him getting home, put her down on her hands and knees with her hands behind her head and shot her repeatedly to the point that she couldn't be recognized. And he went around the house through the evening and shot all the family pets. And sometimes towards morning, with his wife laying there on the floor all night, shot himself. Tragic story, horrible story. But due to Wyoming law, her things are still in the house a year later. Because we can't seem to come to a decision on probate the way the laws are written. So what we're asking today is that we can prevent this kind of tragedy in the future. Not the fact that it's going to happen, but that we can help a family get their daughter's things back. In this particular case, there's no money involved. There's no estate to speak of. A father is simply trying to get his daughter's personal belongings back out of her house, and he can't do that the way the laws are written. So I'm afraid I've got myself a little bit too close to this legislation. If you have questions, I'll stand for them, but that's what we're doing. Thank you very much.
Any discussion on the bill or the standing committee amendment, Senator Nethercott?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd move standing committee amendment number 1 to Senate File 66. Good senators, what the bill does is it makes the bill effective immediately. I'd call for question on the amendment.
Any discussion? Seeing none. All those in favor of Senator Nethercott's motion to adopt the standing committee amendment number 1 to Senate File 66, say aye. Opposed, say no. Okay, we're back on the bill. There is a committee of the whole amendment. Get that read in.
Senate File 66, Committee of the Whole Amendment Number 1, page 1, line 8, before.
Senator Perkins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I move that, I'd like to speak on the bill for just a second, and then we'll go into the amendment if that works for you, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Just to follow that up, in my practice, I do a lot of probate and estate planning and those things, and I've actually had these situations a couple times, and they're horrible. I did once a murder-suicide between a man who was mentally ill, shot his wife, and killed himself. They had substantial real estate holdings, as they were longtime folks here in Wyoming. Had substantial real estate holdings. Because of that, we ended up doing all kinds of things to have to, having one estate sue the other state to move property out. Otherwise, state taxes were going to take a bunch. I mean, there's all kinds. You'd be surprised. I mean, I did one I did another one here just this last year. Son killed his mother, and you had to deal with these things. So these things happen, and unfortunately they happen way too frequently. And so with that, which brings me to the amendment, because what we're doing here is, this isn't, we're trying to fix some ways now that where this property still moves over to the slayer. We haven't quite got all of them. And so with that, I'd go ahead and move, it's been read in, so I'd go ahead and move as committee of the whole amendment number 1 to Senate File 66 and ask for the body's favorable consideration. This does two things. And so if the first thing it does is it simply takes this and adds a new 3, a Romanet 3, and it adds the word, it says that the slayer still can't inherit, receive, or otherwise take any property conveyed by the deceased person by a beneficiary designation, a transfer on death designation, a payable on death designation, or other conveyance that occurs because of the death of the deceased person. And the reason I bring that up is this day and age, and what's happened particularly is we've tried to find ways to avoid probate and make things easier after somebody dies, is we've done a number of things. If you have an IRA, we've done, life insurance is already covered, but we have beneficiary designations in IRAs that don't seem to me to be covered by the law yet. We have, like I say, I think most life insurance is covered under this, and I think probably annuities are covered under this too, but this will help circle around that. So IRAs, it'll make sure of annuities. Anymore, we do either payable on death or transfer on death designations that work just like a beneficiary designation. where a lot of times if I have an account and on my death, it's payable or transferable to this other person. And so it covers that. And it also, and we, in fact, a few years, I think 8 or 9 years ago, this body allowed for transfer on death designations on property, or transfer on death deeds on property. So that the same thing can happen. You transfer property on death. And so what this does, it doesn't affect that unless the person to whom it transfers is the slayer. And so this is also then broadens this net under the first set, under particularly lines 1 through 9. It broadens that to cover those as well. You have, right now those are a little bit different because you don't have a current interest in the property, but you have an expectancy or potentially a future contingent interest in the property. And so it will resolve that issue, which seems to me right down that alley. And actually, Mr. Chairman, at this time, I think it's just, as I think about this, I'd like to divide this amendment, Mr. Chairman. And the first division is, the first division would be lines 3 through line 10. And the second division would be lines 11 through lines 25. And lines 22, I think, are required in both divisions. Actually, I take it back. Lines 1 and 2 go with division 2.
Okay.
And so division 1 is lines 3 through 10. Division 2 is lines 1 and 2 and lines 11 through 25.
Okay, I find that divisible. We're on division 1, lines 3 through 10 of the committee of the whole amendment.
And Mr. Chairman, what I do, that's the explanation of that. It just applies, what I talked about applies just to division 1, and it asks for the body to approve division 1. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any discussion on division 1? Seeing none, all those in favor of committee of the whole amendment division 1, say aye. Opposed, say no. That division passes. We're on division 2.
Thank you. And with respect to division 2, Mr. Chairman, this is a different concept. And quite frankly, as I look at the title of the bill, I think it's beyond the title of this bill to do that. And so at this time, I'd withdraw division 2.
Absent any objection, division 2 is withdrawn. Any further discussion? Bring back tomorrow. Senator Case.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've been thinking about this bill a little bit, and it certainly makes a lot of sense. We had a situation in Lander. It was a murder-suicide sort of thing, but I guess it really wasn't a murder-suicide. It was just a couple that decided to leave this earth together. They were an elderly couple, and one of them was pretty incapacitated, Mr. Chairman. So it was pretty obvious that the other one helped, and then they both decided to do this. They did it together. Now that may or may not be felonious. I don't know how you would ever establish that, because in all of these cases we're talking, nobody's convicted of murder because everybody's gone. So, and I just, it's so common. It's more common than you think that couples die together. And how does that roll into this? And so, and even in that first case, it really did happen in Lander. It's pretty clear that it might have technically been a murder-suicide, but it was willingly performed by both parties. And I know we're not Oregon, but things happen when you get old and you've been living with the same person all your life, and you make decisions that are above and beyond. Love conquers all and takes you into this next world. How does this fit with that? It's not horrific, bloody, manipulative, evil. I think it's almost true love. So help me about this.
Hey, Senator Nethercutt.
It's a lovely evening. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a great question. And this conversation really encapsulates how difficult it is actually to craft legislation in a way that addresses all circumstances that humans can find themselves in. So not only as it relates to this issue, but all that we do today and every day. It's my belief that in this scenario that the senator from Fremont County mentioned, that a technical reading of the bill as written would mean that the spouse that took the life of the other spouse who consented, it wasn't in a horrific act of murder, but rather in an act of compassion and love, would not be able to inherit. Of course, he's deceased, but it wouldn't go to his heirs. Now, the scenario that you present is interesting. So how often would that occur? In a situation where they likely were married and have children together in a traditional situation. Certainly that construct is changing rapidly with time and societal changes, but had they been married for 40 years with joint children, the result is the same, where their joint children would inherit the property. And so there's no harm done in that case. If they did not have joint children, harm could potentially be caused. And I think that that's fair. I do think it's important to recognize that this bill contemplates straight murder, where the murderer survives as well. I mean, it's easy to see in a murder-suicide, but even if the murderer lives and goes to prison, right, he still gets the house if it's owned as joint tenants with rights of survivorship. And so he goes to prison, owning that house or selling that house, and it has to be taken in some other fashion. So, you know, that's in reality more common than not, where the murderer lives, and certainly secondarily common where the murderer commits suicide, even rarer where it's a unusual circumstance like the good senator of Fremont County presented. And I think that would be an unfortunate set of facts. Before they took that action, they should see an estate planner. That's all.
Any further discussion on this bill? Okay, Senator Hicks, or you want to speak? Okay. Okay, seeing no further discussion, the question is, oh, Senator Gold.
On and for the bill. I think the set of facts laid out are clear and compelling. It's a hole in our current law, and this squares that hole. And I look forward to positive consideration. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any further discussion? Senator Case.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I think the set of facts I described are probably more common than we know. And you know, there are a lot of families with they have different children that they brought in this family, and then they live a long time together, truly in love. And this really is an act of compassion within that relationship. There's got to be a way that we can carve this out some way. I mean, it's crazy, but it's, I don't know. This is right on the cusp of a new world, and you're deciding one way about the other. The case where the perpetrator lives, that's clear. But when they're both deceased, it's just not clear unless you've left, there's some other evidence to look at that. There ought to be a way to figure that out. And I don't know how. That's why I hire good lawyers. I wish we had some. I think there probably are.
Okay. Senator Landon.
Mr. Chairman, I'm writing myself a note to get with my trust attorney and make sure I have that worked out. This is such a great bill to bring. I want to salute the sponsor and also the Judiciary Committee for helping to craft this. What gives me some pause is this whole notion of split families and things in a situation like my friend just pointed out. You don't always have them all together, these heirs and children. And if one perpetrates something on another and they both go together, then that may split that. If you haven't seen the senator at the back of the room to get the trust document in place. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think now you're evaluating the scenario through the one that the good senator from Fremont County presented, where it's a consensual death. Now imagine what the Slayer's rule is trying to prevent is the killing of someone else for profit, right? Typically your spouse or some other relative that you would receive profits from. So in this case of the split scenario, without changing this law, my life's worthless. I've done nothing for my children. I have nothing. I'm worth more dead than I am alive. I hate her anyway and her kids. They never loved me. Boom. He owns everything because everything's owned as joint tenants with rights of survivorship because they're spouses. He and his children profit from the murder. The only way to prevent that outcome is for her children to sue in a wrongful death action against the estate. So if we're trying to go with the policy statement that the ancients adopted from Rome, then it would be to prevent profiteering from murder. I go with the wisdom of the elders and get a good estate plan. And, there are probably ways to have other outcomes for the poor couples who are finding themselves at the end. Clearly premeditated. There's time for planning.
Any further discussion? Senator Perkins.
Mr. Chairman, and quite frankly, you find those inequitable things all the time when you have blended families or you have, Wyoming doesn't have common law marriage. And so, which are, common law marriages are, we don't have them, we know what they are. And those, our intestacy laws, and we don't have laws that cover those things. You don't have, your stepchildren don't have rights. They're, in intestacy and those things, that they don't have any rights under the intestacy laws. Now you can fix all that with an estate plan, but, and in fact, as you did it, the memo I withdrew actually resolves a number of those problems. So maybe we'll see that again, but at the end of the day, I mean, who passes away first in a blended family is always a very incredibly important question, because the intestacy statutes provide that half of the, if you don't have a will or you don't have some other document, or you haven't done transfers on deaths or those types of things, the property goes half to the surviving spouse and half to the children who survive. And there's a couple of other exceptions in there. Well, if you're not married, there's no spouse. And if those aren't your kids, even though you may have treated them as your kids, those aren't your kids. And that's the intestacy laws we have. So, like I say, the amendment that I drew, maybe I'll get with you, maybe we bring that back tomorrow, because it maybe provides an instance that you could have that be a little bit differently than just refer to the intestacy laws. But, those are the inequity laws you have. There's just not a way to do that. There are some remedies, and I've been a part of those, where you have one estate sue another estate to try and undo some of the inequities that occur. But the whole point of this is hopefully to avoid that and allow these people to get on with their grieving process. And the other thing to take into consideration, somebody has to come back out and enforce this differently. There's not the intestacy or the will police that are around to make sure you've done all that right. So somebody has to step up and enforce a claim that otherwise, and generally what I find, a lot of times families just work this stuff out, but it's not going to solve every problem, but I think it solves the problem. This bill solves the problem it's intended to solve. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any further discussion?
Question.
Okay, all those in favor of Senator Nethercott's motion that when the committee of the whole rise and report, do so with a favorable recommendation as Senate File 66, say aye. Aye. All those opposed say no. Senate File 66 has passed committee of the whole. Mr. Majority Floor Leader.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee of a whole rise and report.
You've heard the motion. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed say no. Motion carries.
Reading clerk will read the committee of the whole report.
Mr. President, your committee of the whole, having had under considerations bills on general file, begs leave to report as follows. Senate File 116, do pass. Senate Joint Resolution 3, do pass amended. Senate File 143, do pass amended. Senate File 114, do pass amendment. Senate File 99 failed to pass committee of the whole and was indefinitely postponed. Senate File 107, do pass. Senate File 100, do pass amended. Senate File 38, do pass amended. Senate File 39, do pass amended. Senate File 75, do pass amended. Senate File 58, do pass amended. Senate File 66, do pass amended. Senator Boner, Chairman.
Senator Boner,
Mr. President, I move adoption of the committee of the whole report.
you've heard the motion. All in favor, say aye. Those opposed, nay. The report has been adopted. Mr. Majority Floor Leader, that clears the desk.
Mr. President, I move Senate adjourns until 10 o'clock, Friday, March 12th.
Announcements. Senator Scott.
Mr. President, your committee number 4, education, will meet tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. in the room W110. Senate Joint Resolution number 4, school capital construction constitutional amendment. Senate File 138, school board trustees party affiliation. And by way of an advance announcement, on Monday, we hope to take up Senate File 127, Wyoming Learn While You Earn program. That would be Monday.
Senator, go ahead, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. President. Your committee number 10, the perfect 10, I might add, will meet tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. in the Health Spa, otherwise known as Room 6, to discuss Senate File 129, Medicaid coverage, licensed pharmacist.
Stay on this side of the room for a moment. Senator Nethercott.
Thank you, Mr. President. Your number 1 committee will meet tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. to hear Senate File 128, temporary delegation of parental authority, Senate File 137, firearms preemption amendments and applicability, and Senate File 94, prohibiting coerced vaccinations. Senate File 140, human trafficking minors, is also listed to be heard, but in conversation with the sponsor, that bill will not be addressed tomorrow morning. Thank you.
Senator Boner.
Thank you,
First thing
Mr.
up
President. Your committee number 5, agriculture, will meet upon adjournment today, let's say 5:45 in Capitol Extension Room W2, and online to consider House Bill 52, Wyoming School Protein Enhancement Project, House Bill 54, Wyoming Meatpacking Initiative, and House Bill 118, Food Freedom Act amendments.
Further announcements? Any further announcements? You've heard the motion. All those in favor, say aye. Those opposed, nay. Senate will stand adjourned until 10 a.m. Friday, March 12th.